how a spinster refused the Countess. In the ton, a woman's worth was calculated the way a merchant priced a bolt of cloth, by yardage, by how well she would wear over time. Beauty was capital, spent quickly and depreciating by the season. A dowry was currency, and like all currency, it could be counterfeited with enough lace and enough lying. Connections were credit, extended generously to families with land and grudgingly to families without, and a woman who had not secured a husband by 25 was, by the common and cheerfully cruel consensus of London drawing rooms, damaged goods left too long on the shelf, marked down unlikely to sell. Miss Honora Vane did not care to follow that arithmetic. She was 26, which in the ledgers of the ton made her something between a cautionary tale and a punchline. And she had long since stopped waiting for the joke to end. She had a dowry so modest it might have been mistaken for an insult had anyone troubled to insult it directly, a wardrobe 3 seasons out of fashion and mended at every seam that dared to fray, and a tongue sharp enough to strip the varnish off a drawing-room table at 20 paces, which she had learned, early and thoroughly, not to use in front of anyone who mattered. Because the women who used their tongues in front of anyone who mattered, because the women who used their tongues in front of anyone who mattered were the ones whose names became warnings, murmured behind fans for the rest of their natural lives. She had learned other things too. In 6 years of being systematically overlooked by a society that valued nothing in her, and therefore demanded nothing of her, she had learned that invisibility, so often described as a woman's tragedy, was in fact a vantage point if one had the stomach to use it. From the edges of ballrooms she had never been asked to dance in. From the backs of shops where she waited while other women were fitted and flattered and fussed over, she had watched the ton operate with the detached clarity of a naturalist observing a particularly vicious species of bird. She had seen mothers barter their daughters like broodmares at Tattersall's. She had seen men calculate a woman's worth in acres before they had troubled to learn the color of her eyes. She had seen kindness rationed like sugar during a war, doled out only where it might yield a return. She had made her peace with standing outside the machine, watching its gears turn without her. Most days, she told herself this quite firmly, and most days she nearly believed it. It was only on the worst nights, the ones after her sister-in-law had said something particularly cutting about spinsters and cats, or after she had watched some giggling debutante half her age receive a bouquet from a man who would never once look twice at Honora Vane, that some small, stubborn, unregenerate part of her still ached for something the machine had never been built to give a woman like her. She did not examine that ache too closely. Examining it seemed likely to make it worse, the way picking at a wound only ever deepened it. Her family occupied a house on a street respectable enough to maintain appearances, and shabby enough to remind everyone, daily, precisely how far those appearances had to stretch. Her father had died 4 years past, leaving behind a modest estate, a mountain of small debts accumulated through optimism rather than vice, and a son wholly unequipped to manage either. Edmund Vane had inherited his father's signature and his father's tailor's bills, and none of his father's scruples about where the money to pay for either might come from. He had married 2 years since, a woman named Charlotte, whose chief accomplishments were a talent for pianoforte she rarely displayed, and an inexhaustible catalogue of remarks about her sister-in-law's marital prospects, delivered always with the particular relish of a woman secure enough in her own situation to pity someone else's. "You might at least try to be agreeable, Honora," Charlotte said one morning at breakfast, buttering her toast with the concentration of a surgeon. "Lady Farrington's daughter is younger than you and already promised to a viscount's second son. I do wonder sometimes if you enjoy being unmarried. It would explain a great deal." "I enjoy a great many things, Charlotte," Honora said, not looking up from her book. "Solvency mostly, silence on occasion. I confess unmarried status has never struck me as a particular pleasure in itself, but neither has it struck me as a tragedy requiring your commentary at every meal. There is no need to be waspish." "There is every need," Honora said, "when the alternative is agreeing with you," and took her tea out to the small garden behind the house, where the roses her mother had planted before her death still bloomed, uncultivated and unfashionable and entirely without opinions about anyone's marital status, which made them, in Honora's estimation, considerably better company than most of London. It was an ordinary Tuesday then, unremarkable in every particular, that changed the whole shape of her life. The kind of gray, drizzling Tuesday made for errands rather than destiny. the kind of day no one would think to mark on a calendar until long afterward. When it became the day, everything began. Honora had been sent to Madame Yvette's dress shop on Bond Street on the least glamorous errand imaginable, to collect a length of gray wool for her mother's mourning cloak, 4 years overdue for replacement, and finally, at Charlotte's grudging insistence, to be seen to before it embarrassed the family at the next funeral they were obliged to attend. It was not the sort of errand that came with any expectation of consequence. Honora had walked the mile in a light rain with her oldest bonnet and her most practical boots, entirely unprepared for her life to alter course before luncheon. Madame Yvette's shop smelled of new fabric and beeswax, and the particular anxious perfume of women trying to impress one another, a scent Honora had long ago learned to find more amusing than intimidating. She was examining a bolt of cambric near the window, turning over the question of whether her mother might be persuaded toward a slightly finer weave than strict economy demanded, when the bell above the door rang with a violence that suggested its ringer considered doors, like servants, to exist chiefly for her convenience. Honora looked up. An elderly seamstress, small, stooped, dressed in a faded gray gown darned so many times at the elbows that the darning had become its own kind of pattern, had been kneeling by the door, pinning the hem of a walking dress on the shop's dummy, precisely where a woman entering in haste might not think to look before she trod. The newcomer's skirts caught the old woman full across the shoulder, and she went down hard, sprawling into a rack of ribbons that clattered and swayed in scattered spools across the floorboards like a rebuke. No one in the room was prepared to voice. The girl who had knocked her down did not stop. She did not even glance back. "You there, old woman. Move," she said, to the space where the seamstress had been standing, as though the collision had been the floor's fault rather than her own, and swept further into the shop with the settled, oblivious confidence of a girl who had never once in her life been made to consider that a room might contain people whose comfort mattered as much as her own. Honora recognized her instantly, as did everyone within 100 miles of Mayfair, for the Pembertons had spent an entire fortune ensuring recognition was unavoidable. Miss Cordelia Pemberton was perhaps 19. Golden-haired, dressed in a walking gown so aggressively, expensively fashionable that it seemed less a garment than an announcement of its own price, made anew each season lest anyone forget precisely how much the Pembertons had to spend on forgetting where they had come from. Behind her, trailing at the exact distance that suggested long practice, came her mother, Mrs. Beatrix Pemberton, surveying the shop with the flat, assessing expression of a woman inspecting livestock she had already privately decided not to purchase, though she had not yet troubled to tell the livestock so. The old seamstress struggled to rise. One hand braced against the ribbon rack, wincing as she gathered the pins that had scattered across the floor around her like a small silver constellation. No one moved to help her. Madame Yvette, whose entire livelihood depended on keeping women like the Pembertons satisfied, suddenly discovered urgent business behind her counter that required her full attention and both eyes averted. 2 other patrons, examining bolts of muslin near the back of the shop, developed a sudden and profound interest in the wallpaper. This was the unspoken law of Bond Street, understood by everyone who had ever set foot on it. One did not intervene on behalf of servants, seamstresses, shopgirls, or anyone whose displeasure carried no social consequence. One simply did not see. Seeing was a luxury reserved for those who could afford the awkwardness that came after. Honora set down the cambric. "Perhaps," she said, crossing the room without any particular hurry, as though she had all the time in the world and intended to spend a good portion of it on this exact moment, "you might apologize to her." Cordelia Pemberton turned, and for a moment her face registered nothing but genuine astonishment that anyone had spoken to her at all, let alone in that tone level, unhurried, entirely unimpressed. "I beg your pardon?" "You barreled into her like a runaway carriage with no driver," Honora said, kneeling beside the old woman to help her gather the last of the scattered pins. "An apology seems the very least you owe her. A helping hand would exceed my expectations, but I've learned not to hope for miracles from strangers on Bond Street." "I owe a seamstress nothing." Cordelia's laugh was bright and brittle and pitched, Honora noted, for an audience, meant to carry to every corner of the shop, meant to establish, publicly and permanently, exactly where the balance of power in this small confrontation was assumed to lie. "Do you have any idea who I am?" I do, Honora said, rising, brushing pin dust from her skirts with the unhurried calm of a woman who had rehearsed this precise composure through 6 years of practice on lesser insults. Which is precisely why I expected better manners from you, Miss Pemberton, and precisely why I find myself entirely unsurprised to discover none. A ripple went through the shop. The particular electric hush that precedes a scene women will still be discussing at dinner parties a fortnight hence, embellished a little more with every retelling. Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward then, jewels flashing at her throat like a warning, her voice pitched, like her daughter's, for maximum carrying power. And who precisely do you imagine yourself to be, that you feel entitled to lecture my daughter on manners in a public shop? No one of any consequence whatsoever, Honora said, and found she meant it not as self-deprecation, but as simple fact, offered without either shame or apology, which is, I find, the only vantage from which manners can ever be judged honestly. Those of consequence are rarely told the truth about themselves. Everyone around them is too busy calculating what the truth might cost. Cordelia's face went the color of a ripe plum left too long in the sun. She cast about the room, visibly, for some wound to open in the stranger who had dared interrupt her, some flaw in the plain, unfashionable dress, some deficiency in the unremarkable bonnet, some crack in that infuriating composure, and finding nothing immediately at hand, reached instead for the only weapon London had ever thoroughly taught her to use, the one weapon guaranteed, in her experience, to land. "You must be Miss Vane," she said, letting the name drip from her mouth with false, poisonous recognition, as though she had only just placed a face she had secretly been cataloguing for exactly this purpose. "I've heard of you, you know. 26, unwed, and no fortune worth the mentioning. Tell me, Miss Vane, do you take up the cause of seamstresses because you fear you'll soon be applying to become one yourself?" The shop went silent enough that Honora could hear the rain ticking against the window glass, could hear Madame Yvette's sharp intake of breath from behind the counter, could hear, distantly, her own pulse in her ears. She did not flinch. She had absorbed worse than this at her own family's breakfast table, delivered with considerably more affection and no less precision, and she had long ago discovered that the surest way to disarm a blow aimed at wounding was to decline, visibly and completely, to be wounded by it. "I would rather earn my bread honestly at 26, she said evenly, than spend my youth learning to be cruel to those who cannot answer back for fear of losing their livelihood. You have mastered that particular art remarkably early, Miss Pemberton. I confess I find myself wondering what you imagine it will have cost you, by the time you reach my age and discover no one left willing to tell you the truth about it." She turned back to the old seamstress without waiting to observe the full effect of the blow, though she felt it land regardless, heard Cordelia's sharp, wounded inhale, heard Mrs. Pemberton's low, furious whisper as she seized her daughter's arm and steered her toward the door with the brisk efficiency of a woman salvaging a battlefield retreat, heard the girl's heels striking the floorboards like small, indignant drums all the way out. The bell above the door rang again, violently. They were gone. The shop, as one, exhaled. Honora knelt beside the old woman, who had gone very still throughout the entire exchange, watching her with an expression Honora could not immediately place, something sharper and more considering than mere gratitude, something almost like recognition, as though she had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this scene to play out in exactly this way. "Are you hurt?" Honora asked, offering her hand. "Only my dignity, my dear, and that recovers rather faster than my knees these days." The old woman's voice, Honora noticed only now, did not entirely match her dress. There was a cultivation to it, an unhurried precision, that seemed out of step with a woman who had just been knocked to the floor of a shop by a girl 30 years her junior. "You needn't have troubled yourself on my account. I am quite accustomed to being trodden upon. One develops a certain philosophy about it. I didn't do it on your account," Honora said, helping her rise, steadying her with a hand at the elbow until she was certain the old woman's balance had returned. "I did it because someone ought to have, and it was entirely clear no one else in this shop intended to trouble themselves. I find that intolerable in a way I've never quite learned to sit still for, whatever it costs me socially, which, I assure you, is very little these days. I've long since spent whatever social credit I might once have had." The old woman studied her for a long moment, head tilted, in the manner of a woman conducting a private examination whose criteria she had no intention of sharing. "That," she said at last, is a rarer creed than you know, Miss. Vane, Honora said. Miss Honora Vane. Miss Vane, the old woman repeated, as though committing the name to some permanent ledger. I shall remember it. Honora helped her gather the last of the scattered pins from the floorboards. Then, on an impulse she did not examine too closely at the time, crossed to Madame Yvette's counter and purchased a small paper of good steel needles, sharper and finer than anything in the seamstress's own worn case, which Honora had noticed, in passing, was bent and blunted from years of hard use, and pressed them into the old woman's hands. For your work, she said simply. Yours look worn through, and a seamstress with dull needles is a seamstress fighting her own tools all day. It seemed a small enough thing to fix. The old woman closed her weathered fingers around the small paper parcel, with an expression that was, for just a moment, entirely unguarded. Something like reverence and something, beneath it, like quiet amusement, as though she had been given a gift far larger than its price and knew it, even if the giver did not. You have done me a kindness today, Miss Vane, she said, that you will not soon understand the full size of. She gathered her basket of pins and ribbon offcuts, straightened as much as her stooped back allowed, and paused at the door, one hand on the frame, looking back with an expression that lingered somewhere between warning and promise. I suspect we shall meet again. Honora thought little of it in the moment. An old woman's odd, formal parting courtesy, delivered with more weight than the occasion strictly warranted. Nothing more than that, and returned to the counter to complete the far duller business of her mother's mourning wool, paid for it with the careful economy that governed every purchase the Vane household made, and stepped out onto Bond Street a quarter-hour later with the parcel of gray cloth under her arm and no particular thought in her head, beyond the walk home and whether the rain had worsened. It was there on the pavement outside Madame Yvette's shop that she stopped entirely still. The old seamstress, her gray gown and darned elbows and worn basket entirely unchanged, was being handed, with a ceremony that bordered on liturgical, into a magnificent crested carriage by two liveried footmen in identical blue livery, while a small crowd of passers-by paused, unbidden, to bow and murmur and generally behave as though something of genuine consequence had just occurred on an ordinary street in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Honora stared at the crest on the carriage door, gold on black, unmistakable to anyone who had ever so much as glanced at the society papers her sister-in-law devoured with such relish over breakfast, even to a spinster who claimed, loudly and with decreasing conviction, not to care for such things. Great heaven, Honora murmured, mostly to herself. I gave sewing needles to a duchess. Marquess, actually, said a voice behind her, low and dry and entirely too close for a stranger. Though a dowager marquess, if we are being precise about it, which she generally insists upon when she can be bothered to correct anyone at all. I doubt she troubled to correct you. She so rarely allows anyone the satisfaction of being right in her presence. Honora turned and found herself, for one disorienting moment, looking directly at a waistcoat button, which told her a great deal about the man attached to it, before she had even lifted her gaze to his face. He was tall in the particular way that made door frames suspicious of him on sight, broad through the shoulder in a manner that suggested more time spent on horseback than in drawing rooms, dressed with a plainness of cut that somehow read as considerably more expensive than Cordelia Pemberton's entire ensemble had done, not 20 minutes prior. His face was handsome in a way too severe, too watchful, to be called merely handsome, a hard, unforgiving jaw, a mouth that looked entirely unaccustomed to the exercise of smiling, and eyes the gray of a winter sea just before a storm, fixed now on the departing carriage with an expression of exasperated, unmistakable tenderness that sat strangely, almost tenderly wrong, on so forbidding a face. Your grandmother? Honora gasped when the silence had stretched a beat too long for comfort. My mother, he said, and something in the flatness of his delivery suggested this was not the first time the mistake had been made, nor was it likely to be the last, which will tell you something of the vigor of her constitution, Miss Vane, and considerably more about the extent of my patience. His gray eyes moved from the departing carriage to settle on her instead, and the attention in them felt, disconcertingly, like being weighed on some private scale and found, against expectation, genuinely interesting. She has taken, of late, to dressing herself as a seamstress and haunting the shops of Bond Street, to discover for herself which women of the ton still possess a conscience beneath their bonnets. It is, I am given to understand, a smaller number than either of us would like. I was not aware I was sitting for an examination. Neither is anyone else, he said, until they have already failed it, which is rather the point, I gather. My mother does not believe in warning people they are being tested. She says forewarned people perform virtue rather than practicing it, and she has no patience for performances. A ghost of something crossed his face that might, on a less guarded man, have qualified as the beginning of a smile. You are the first in a fortnight to pass. I wasn't aware there was a pass at all, let alone a fortnight's worth of failures preceding me. There generally is, he said. Rothmere, he added, with the barest inclination of his head, offering no further introduction, as though his name alone were sufficient fact of nature to require no elaboration, which, Honora reflected, in London it very nearly was. Miss Vane, she said, and did not curtsy and did not simper, and watched something flicker behind his winter-gray eyes that looked remarkably like approval at a refusal to do either. I know, he said. My mother does not forget a name that has earned itself in her presence, Miss Vane, and she has already spoken yours twice since we left the shop, which is, in her case, a species of high praise most duchesses would kill outright to receive. Good day. He was gone before she could compose any response equal to the peculiar weight of the moment, striding after his mother's carriage with the unhurried, entirely unbothered authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry for anyone and had long ago stopped pretending otherwise. Honora walked the mile home in a state of mind she did not care to examine too closely, told herself quite firmly, twice, that it was nothing at all, and found, by the time she reached her own front door, that she had entirely failed to convince herself. She did not tell Charlotte about the encounter. She barely told herself, turning it over privately in the quiet hour before sleep, the way one turns over a coin found in the street, uncertain whether it is genuine currency or some clever forgery designed to disappoint on closer inspection. She told herself that a marquess's passing courtesy to a woman who had shown his mother a kindness meant nothing beyond ordinary good manners, that men like Rothmere did not remember spinsters with modest dowries past the length of a single conversation, and that she would do well to file the entire afternoon away as a pleasant curiosity and nothing more. She held it as resolution for almost 4 days, which she considered, privately, a personal triumph of discipline. The invitation arrived on the 5th morning, delivered by a footman in blue livery so fine that the Vane household's own aging manservant, Toby, nearly dropped the salver bearing it, and threw the entire household into an uproar, the likes of which Honora had not witnessed since her father's creditors had last called in a body, some 3 years prior, demanding satisfaction in tones considerably less polite than the ones now employed by Rothmere House's correspondents. Rothmere, Edmund breathed, turning the heavy cream card over in his hands as though he suspected it might be counterfeit, or perhaps some elaborate practical joke orchestrated by a rival family with a grudge. The Marquess of Rothmere has sent an invitation to his ball. Honora, do you have the faintest notion what this means? He hasn't hosted so much as a card party in 3 years, not since old Lord Rothmere died and left him the whole encumbered mess of it. Half of London has been trying to secure an invitation to that house since the mourning period ended, and it has arrived here, at this address, addressed to this family. It means his mother liked my needles, Honora said, buttering her toast with rather more attention than the task strictly required, and refused, despite considerable and increasingly desperate pressing from both her brother and Charlotte across the following 3 days and no fewer than 4 separate meals, to elaborate any further than that single maddening sentence. Edmund's eyes, throughout those 3 days, took on a particular gleam. Honora had learned to recognize and dread in equal measure. The gleam he reserved for opportunities he considered too valuable to be squandered by anyone, least of all his own inconvenient sister. She understood, without being told directly, though he told her a great deal indirectly, that the family situation had grown considerably more precarious than even Charlotte's pointed breakfast remarks had suggested. She had gathered from fragments overheard through closed doors and the particular strain in Edmund's voice when certain letters arrived, that there was a debt, not merely the usual accumulation of tailor's bills and unpaid accounts that had characterized the Vane finances since her father's death, but something sharper and more urgent, owed to a moneylender in the city whose patience, by all accounts, was measured in weeks rather than years. You will be amiable, Edmund informed her the morning of the ball itself, adjusting his cravat before the hall mirror with the fussy precision of a man rehearsing for a performance he could not afford to fail, while Honora stood behind him in the small entrance hall, already dressed in her one good gown, a soft gray-green silk, 3 seasons old but well kept, the only truly fine thing she owned, saved from her mother's final gift before her death. You will not say anything cutting, Honora, whatever provocation presents itself. You will not embarrass this family in front of a man who could, with a single word to his solicitor, restore our fortunes entirely. I am perfectly aware of arithmetic, Edmund, Honora said. I have simply declined, for 6 years now, to be reduced to a sum in someone else's ledger, and I do not intend to begin the practice tonight on your account. This is not about my account, Edmund snapped, and then catching himself, softened his tone into something more pleading than commanding, which Honora found, if anything, considerably harder to resist. It is about all of us, Honora. Mother's health, Charlotte's confinement, come winter, the house. I am not asking you to marry the man on the strength of one dance. I'm asking you not to salt the ground before anything has had the chance to grow. Honora said nothing to that, because there was, buried somewhere beneath her brother's self-interest, a genuine and frightened truth she could not entirely dismiss, and she went to dress for the evening with a weight in her chest she had not carried into a ballroom in a very long time. She had, in the intervening days, called on her one true friend in London, a task that required no more than a short walk, since Miss Prudence Holloway lived but 2 streets distant, in a house scarcely grander than the Vanes' own, and had been Honora's confidant since they were girls sharing a governess who despaired equally of both their tempers. Prudence was 28, unmarried by circumstance rather than temperament, having nursed an invalid mother through a long illness that had consumed the years other women spent in ballrooms, and possessed a wit nearly as sharp as Honora's own, tempered by a gentleness Honora had never quite managed to cultivate in herself. A marquess, Prudence said, when Honora had finished recounting the whole strange business of the dress shop and the carriage and the waistcoat button, delivered over tea in Prudence's small, sunlit parlor. Honora Vane, dancing with the Marquess of Rothmere. I confess I would not have believed it from any other source. He is said to be quite impossible. Cold as a winter pond, and twice as likely to leave a woman with wet feet for her trouble. He did not strike me as cold, Honora said, and heard in her own voice a note of defensiveness she had not intended to reveal, which Prudence, naturally, caught at once, her eyebrows lifting with delighted interest. Did he not? Prudence said, in the tone of a woman filing away a very useful piece of information for later deployment. Well, whatever he struck you as, I should be careful, dearest. A man in his position could ruin you with kindness as easily as with cruelty. If kindness is all he intends, and nothing more comes of it. London will not forgive you for dancing with a marquess and then failing to marry him. They will say you overreached, and they will enjoy saying it enormously. London may say what it likes, Honora said. London has been saying unkind things about me since I was 21, and declined Mr. Peabody's offer on the grounds that I found him tedious beyond human endurance. I have grown a very thick skin in the intervening years, Prue. I do not intend to grow thin again over a single dance that may well come to nothing. But she had thought of little else in the days since, and Prudence, watching her with the particular sympathy of a woman who had long ago made her own peace with a life that had not gone as planned, did not press the point further, only refilled Honora's teacup and changed the subject to the considerably safer territory of a new novel they had both been reading, borrowed in installments from the circulating library and passed between them like contraband. Now, dressed and gloved and standing in the entrance hall, while Edmund fussed over his own appearance in the mirror, Honora found herself wishing, briefly and uncharacteristically, that she had thought to ask Prudence to accompany her, though Prudence had not been invited, an omission that stung on her friend's behalf more sharply than any slight Honora had ever received on her own. You look well, Charlotte said, descending the stairs in a gown considerably finer than anything the household's finances strictly permitted. Examining Honora with the critical eye of a woman assessing a horse she did not expect to place well, but might, with luck, avoid disgracing the stable. That gray-green does something for your complexion. It has no business doing. Do try not to say anything that undoes the effect. I shall endeavor to let my complexion speak for itself, Honora said. and climbed into the hired carriage before her sister-in-law could formulate a reply, settling into the worn seat cushions with her hands folded tightly in her lap and her heart, despite every effort at composure, beating rather faster than the occasion, by any reasonable accounting, should have warranted. Rothmere House, when the carriage finally drew up before it in a queue of a dozen others, was lit like a small private sun set down in the middle of Mayfair, every window blazing with candlelight, the great doors thrown open to receive a crush of silk and jewels that seemed, from the pavement, to stretch back into some impossible interior distance. Honora had attended balls before, smaller ones, lesser ones, the sort hosted by families whose fortunes ran to an adequate supper and a competent quartet rather than an entire orchestra and ice sculptures carved, she would later learn, into the shape of swans. But she had never before stood at the threshold of anything quite so deliberately, so calculatedly magnificent. The entrance hall alone contained more flowers than Honora's mother's garden had produced in a decade, banked in great white drifts along the marble staircase, their scent competing with the mingled perfumes of 200 guests and the hot wax of 1,000 candles, until the air itself felt thick enough to wear. Footmen in Rothmere's blue livery moved through the crush with trays of champagne balanced on gloved palms, weaving between clusters of guests with the practiced invisibility of men trained, since boyhood, never to be seen, except when required. Somewhere beyond a forest of ostrich plumes and towering headdresses, an orchestra tuned itself toward the opening strains of the evening's first set. It was excess arranged as architecture, wealth expressed not merely in possession, but in the sheer confidence of its display, and Honora, standing just inside the ballroom doors in her 3 seasons-old gray-green silk, watching Edmund and Charlotte already dissolving into the crowd toward whatever acquaintances might prove useful, felt the old familiar ache of standing at the edge of a world built, quite deliberately, to exclude a woman precisely like her. She was not entirely alone in the observation. A voice at her elbow, dry and amused, said, "It is rather a lot, isn't it? I have always found excessive flower arrangements to be the surest indication that a hostess has run out of actual conversation to offer her guests and has decided to substitute botany instead." Honora turned to find a young man regarding the ballroom with an expression of theatrical despair entirely at odds with the evident enjoyment in his eyes. Fair-haired, slight, dressed with a foppish flourish that suggested more interest in fashion than in fortune, though something in the set of his jaw suggested a sharper intelligence than his coxcomb's cravat implied. "Mr. Julian Faircroft," he said, bowing with a flourish that managed to be both perfectly correct and faintly mocking of its own correctness. "I do apologize for the impertinence of introducing myself without a proper mutual acquaintance to perform the office, but I have observed you standing here for the better part of 2 minutes with the exact expression of a woman calculating how quickly she might escape without giving offense, and I felt compelled, as a fellow sufferer of these occasions, to offer solidarity." "Miss Vane," Honora said, unable to entirely suppress a smile, "and you have read my expression with alarming accuracy, Mr. Faircroft. I confess I was, in fact, calculating precisely that. An excellent instinct, generally speaking, though I would advise against acting upon it tonight." Faircroft accepted 2 glasses of champagne from a passing footman and handed one to Honora without asking whether she wanted it, which she found, oddly, less presumptuous than practical. "I understand our host has broken a 3-year silence for this occasion, which means every unmarried woman in London between the ages of 17 and 30 has turned out in her finest plumage to compete for his attention, and every mother in London has spent a small fortune ensuring her daughter's plumage is finer than the rest. It promises to be a remarkably instructive evening, if one enjoys watching ambition dressed up as charm." "You do not sound as though you enjoy it particularly." "I enjoy it enormously," Faircroft said, with a grin that suggested genuine mischief beneath the fop's polish. "I simply enjoy it as a spectator rather than a participant, having neither fortune nor title sufficient to render me interesting to anyone's mother, which leaves me blessedly free to observe the whole business without personal stake. It is the only advantage of being a second son, Miss Vane, and I recommend it highly, on the rare occasions when it presents itself to persons not born to the condition." Honora found herself unexpectedly grateful for his company. A fellow observer, content to watch the machine turn without needing to be crushed by its gears, and might have spent a pleasant quarter-hour in his company entirely, had the crowd near the ballroom's center not begun, at that moment, to shift and murmur in the particular way crowds do when something of consequence is about to occur. Across the room, beneath the largest of the chandeliers, Cordelia Pemberton stood in a gown of pale gold silk that had, by all evidence, cost more than the Vane household's annual income. Surrounded by a cluster of admiring young men and one visibly anxious mother, wearing an expression of serene proprietary triumph, as though the entire glittering apparatus of the evening had been assembled expressly in her honor. And she had simply been waiting, with admirable patience, for everyone else to recognize the fact. She was wrong, though it would take the room several more minutes to discover precisely how wrong. The Marquess of Rothmere entered from a side door without fanfare of any kind. No herald, no announcement, nothing beyond the simple fact of his presence, and the room's attention swung toward him regardless, as inexorably as iron filings toward a lodestone. Every unmarried woman present arranging herself, in the space of a single breath, into her most flattering angle. Every mother steering her daughter a half-step closer to whatever path he might be inclined to walk. He wore black, unrelieved by any ornament beyond a single signet ring, and looked, Honora thought, less like a man attending his own ball than like a man enduring a necessary ordeal with grim, practiced composure. He scanned the crowd once, briefly, with the flat, assessing disinterest of a man counting obstacles rather than admiring an audience, and then his eyes found Honora, standing half in shadow near the doors with Julian Faircroft at her elbow, and stopped entirely. "Well," Faircroft murmured with evident and immediate delight, "this promises to be considerably more instructive than I had anticipated." Rothmere crossed the entire length of the ballroom to reach her. It was not a short distance, and the room watched every step of it with the rapt, breathless attention of an audience witnessing a scene they would recount with increasing embellishment for months to come. Watched him pass a cluster of eligible young women who arranged themselves hopefully in his path. Watched him pass Lady Farrington's daughter, betrothed though she was, who nonetheless could not resist a hopeful glance. Watched him pass Lady Farrington's daughter, betrothed though she was, who nonetheless could not resist a hopeful glance. Watched him pass, at last, directly by Cumberton, whose triumphant slike contain and bear to a parenth. Her good gamme kunanad, and an eventually retired. He stopped before Honora Vane and bowed as though there were no one else of any consequence present to witness it. "Miss Vane," he said, "you came." "Apparently I had needles to thank you for," she said, and heard quite distinctly the collective intake of breath from the nearest cluster of onlookers, already composing, she did not doubt, the exact phrasing they intended to employ when repeating this exchange to everyone they knew by morning. "Dance with me," he said. It was not by any stretch of grammar phrased as a question. "I don't recall being asked. I don't recall asking anyone anything as a general rule," he said, entirely unbothered by the observation. "I find that requests invite the possibility of refusal, and I have never developed much tolerance for refusal, having been so rarely required to accept it. I am making an exception for you, Miss Vane, on both counts, the asking and the possibility of the answer displeasing me. Will you dance with me? Since you have gone to the considerable trouble of asking properly," she said, setting aside her untouched champagne, "I suppose I must, if only to reward the effort." Beside her, Faircroft executed a bow of theatrical magnitude and murmured, low enough for Honora alone to hear, "I shall expect a full account tomorrow, Miss Vane, or I shall be forced to invent one considerably more scandalous than whatever actually occurs, purely to entertain myself," before melting back into the crowd with a wink that Honora found, despite the gravity of the moment, entirely impossible not to appreciate. Rothmere's hand at her waist was steady and warm through the thin silk of her gown, and when the music began, a waltz, which Honora noted with some private alarm, being considerably more intimate a dance than the country set she had expected, she discovered, to her considerable surprise, that the Marquess of Rothmere danced precisely as he spoke, without ornament, without flattery, entirely and unnervingly present. "You're wondering why I invited you," he said as they turned beneath the blazing chandeliers, the rest of the room seeming, for the length of the dance, to recede into a blur of color and noise at the edges of Honora's attention. "I had assumed it was the needles." "It was the courage," he said. "Half of London witnessed my mother knocked to the floor of that shop. Servants, patrons, that useless modiste who values Pemberton custom over her own conscience, every one of them saw, and every one of them found somewhere else to look. You were the only person in that room who moved." Cowardice is remarkably contagious in a room full of people watching their own reputations more closely than they watch each other, Honora said. I find I have very little reputation left to protect, at 26 and unwed. It is, I have discovered, remarkably freeing once one stops mourning the loss of it. Something shifted in his face at that. Not quite a smile, but its foundation, the ground upon which a smile might eventually be built, given sufficient encouragement. I have spent 11 years being hunted for a title I did not choose and a fortune I inherited before I was old enough to properly understand its weight, he said, his voice low, pitched for her alone beneath the swell of the orchestra. My father died when I was 28 and left me an estate mortgaged nearly to its rafters. A mother who had spent 30 years learning to manage him and had to learn almost overnight to manage me instead, and a title that every unmarried woman in England has treated, ever since, as a prize to be won rather than a burden to be shared. Every woman in this room tonight has spent the evening performing some version of herself she believes I would prefer to see. You are the only one who has not, once, attempted to flatter me. Would you like me to? God, no, he said with such immediate, fervent honesty that she laughed aloud, startled out of composure by the sheer force of his sincerity, and watched something warm, entirely unguarded, kindle behind his winter-gray eyes at the sound of it, as though he had been cold a very long while and had only just noticed with some private astonishment that he was not cold now. I find, he said, that I am thoroughly disillusioned with nearly everyone in this room. How fortunate, Honora said. I have been disillusioned with them for the better part of 6 years. We might compare notes at some length, if you can spare the time from being hunted. I believe I can arrange it. They danced past the 2 sets that propriety generally allowed a single partner, and continued well into a third, which was, Honora understood from the increasingly urgent whispers trailing them like smoke through the ballroom, tantamount to a public declaration requiring no further clarification whatsoever, and found, to her own considerable and rather alarming astonishment, that she did not care in the slightest what conclusions the room chose to draw. Tell me something true, he said during a slower turn near the edge of the floor. Not something clever? Something true. I have had a surfeit of clever tonight already, and the evening is not half finished. Honora considered this for a moment, matching his pace, aware of the warmth of his hand at her waist in a way she found both unsettling and, disconcertingly, welcome. I am afraid, she said finally, that I have spent so many years perfecting the art of not wanting anything, that I no longer entirely trust myself to recognize wanting something when it finally arrives. I do not know if that is truth or merely confession. Perhaps they are the same thing in the end. He was quiet for the space of several turns, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its customary flatness. I have spent a comparable number of years perfecting the art of assuming everyone wants something from me, he said. It has left me equally poor at recognizing when someone wants nothing at all, which I begin to suspect, Miss Vane, may be your particular and rather devastating talent. The set ended before Honora could formulate any reply adequate to that, and she was grateful for it, uncertain her voice would have obeyed her had she attempted one. It was the Dowager Marchioness who found her afterward, materializing at Honora's elbow with the brisk, unstoppable efficiency of a woman long accustomed to being obeyed the instant she appeared, and drew her by the arm into a quiet alcove off the supper room, curtained in dark green velvet and mercifully removed from the worst of the crush. Sit, said the Marchioness. And Honora sat, still recognizing beneath tonight's silk and diamonds, the same seamstress who had knelt on the floor of Madame Yvette's shop not a week before, though the transformation was, she had to admit, thoroughly convincing. You have quite ruined my son's evening, you know. He has not danced 3 consecutive sets with any single woman since his father's funeral, and I begin to suspect he has now permanently ruined his reputation for aloofness, which I confess I shall not mourn over much. I hadn't meant to ruin anything, my lady. I did not say I minded the ruining. The Marchioness's dry humor sat on her like a well-worn and much-loved shawl, comfortable from long use. Gabriel was 28 when his father died, and left him an estate mortgaged nearly to its rafters and a mother he had to learn to manage rather than lean upon, which I assure you was no small undertaking on either side. Every woman who has looked at him since has seen either a fortune to be repaired through marriage or a title to be worn like a very expensive glove. You looked at an old woman lying on the floor of a dress shop, Miss Vane, and saw simply a person who needed help. That is a rarer thing than you perhaps understand, and my son understands it too. Whatever nonsense he tells himself about disillusionment and duty and the impossibility of ever again trusting his own judgment where women are concerned. Honora did not know what adequate response existed for such candor, delivered with such unhurried, matter-of-fact conviction, and so said nothing at all, which the marquess seemed to find entirely satisfactory, patting her hand once with brisk approval before continuing. "I tested 6 women before you, this season alone," she said. 6. I dressed as everything from a flower seller to a companion seeking a position, and every single one of them either ignored me entirely or, worse, recognized some vague resemblance to a portrait hanging in a house they had once visited, and fawned over me accordingly, hedging their kindness against the possibility of reward. You did neither. You gave an old woman needles because her needles were dull, and thought no further about it than that until you saw the carriage. I watched your face when you saw the carriage, Miss Vane, from the window above the shop. I confess I have rarely enjoyed anything so thoroughly as your expression in that moment. You were spying on me then, in addition to testing me. Naturally, said the marquess, entirely unrepentant. How else does one separate genuine character from a performance staged for an unseen audience? One must remove the audience first and observe what remains. They were interrupted, at that moment, by a commotion at the alcove's velvet curtain. Cordelia Pemberton, propelled through the gap by her mother's iron grip on her elbow, arriving with the stiff, mutinous posture of a girl performing contrition entirely under duress and resenting every second of the performance. "Miss Vane," Cordelia said, the words dragged out of her as though extracted with pliers, her eyes fixed somewhere over Honora's left shoulder rather than meeting her gaze directly. "I regret my behavior at Madame Yvette's shop. I hope you will accept my apology." Honora regarded her for a long, considering moment, aware of the marquess watching the exchange with an expression of frank, unhidden interest, aware too of Mrs. Pemberton's fingers still gripping her daughter's arm with a pressure visible even through the fabric of Cordelia's sleeve. "No," Honora said gently, and watched Cordelia's carefully composed mask of contrition dissolve instantly into genuine, startled offense. "I don't think I shall, Miss Pemberton. Not tonight. I beg your pardon. An apology extorted under threat of social ruin is not, in fact, an apology," Honora said. "It is merely damage control, dressed carefully in an apology's borrowed clothing, offered not from any genuine regret, but from fear of what continued silence might cost you socially. Now that half of London has heard how the evening's incident concluded, I would rather you kept your resentment honest, Miss Pemberton, than performed a contrition you plainly do not feel, purely for an audience whose good opinion you are afraid of losing. When you mean it, if you ever come to mean it, I shall be glad to hear it properly. Until then, I think we do each other no favors by insulting one another with theater neither of us believes." Cordelia's mouth opened and closed twice, finding no adequate response, her face cycling rapidly through several shades of outrage before settling on something closer to genuine, wounded confusion, as though she had expected, had perhaps been promised, by whatever calculation had brought her to this alcove, that the apology, however insincere, would be accepted. The incident closed, the social ledger balanced and returned to its proper order. Instead, she found herself refused, and refused, moreover, in terms that left her with no graceful retreat. Mrs. Pemberton hauled her daughter away in a fury too pointed for whispers, her voice rising audibly even before they had cleared the curtain. Something about ungrateful spinsters and inappropriate familiarity with people quite above her station, and the marquess, watching them go, laughed outright. A startling, delighted bark of a sound entirely unbefitting a woman of her age and dignity, drawing several curious glances from the nearby crowd. "Oh, I like you enormously," she said, wiping one eye with the corner of a lace handkerchief. "I do believe Gabriel will make a considerable mess of courting you properly, Miss Vane. He has had absolutely no practice at it, having spent the last 11 years actively discouraging the exercise, but I find myself entirely willing to watch the attempt regardless. It promises to be considerably more entertaining than anything else London has offered me this season." Across the ballroom, in the shadow of a column near the refreshment table, Cordelia Pemberton stood rigid with humiliation while her mother hissed instructions into her ear, and it was there, watching the pair of them, that Honora first noticed a third figure observing the scene with rather more interest than the moment strictly warranted. A woman perhaps 35, elegantly dressed in deep blue, whom Honora did not recognize, watching not Cordelia's humiliation, but Honora would not fully understand the significance. Unwaitable. Interest without entirely late to conmedi, without to corde. By morning, the Vane household had transformed the previous evening's events into a campaign requiring the coordinated efforts of the entire family. Edmund paced the breakfast room reciting, with the fervor of a man reading scripture, the precise acreage of the Rothmere estates as reported in the previous season's survey, while Charlotte sat opposite him composing, on a fresh sheet of good paper, a list of calls that must now be made, in what order, and to whom, in order to properly capitalize on the connection before some other family thought to interfere with it. "You will not mention the shop girl business again," Edmund instructed. Between bites of toast he seemed too agitated to properly taste. "It reflects poorly, Honora, however admirable your intentions. Gentlemen do not care to be reminded that their mothers dress as paupers and go about testing strangers like a woman conducting an inspection of the livestock at market. You will not argue politics, whatever he raises. You will, for once in your natural life, simply agree with the man and allow him to feel himself agreed with." "I will not," Honora said, rising from the table before her tea had properly cooled, "pretend to be someone I am not, in order to be found more acceptable by a man who has, thus far, shown every sign of preferring me precisely as I already am, disagreements and all. If that preference does not survive my honesty, Edmund, then it was never worth having in the first place, and no amount of pretending on my part will make it otherwise. You have the luxury of philosophy, Honora, because you have never once had to watch a moneylender's clerk stand in this very hallway and explain, with excessive and unnecessary politeness, precisely what will happen to this family if certain sums are not produced by Michaelmas." Edmund's voice cracked, briefly, on the last word, and Honora saw, for just a moment, beneath her brother's bluster, something closer to genuine fear than she had credited him with feeling. "I am not asking you to sell yourself. Whatever you imagine I am asking. I am asking you not to salt the ground before anything has had the chance to take root. That is all. That is the whole of my request." She left the house before she could construct any adequate reply to that, because there was, buried beneath Edmund's self-interest and Charlotte's calculation, a genuine desperation she found she could not entirely dismiss, however much his methods offended her, and walked the mile to the small, unfashionable public garden near the river where she had gone as a girl to think, where no member of the ton would think to look for a woman past marriage wandering unaccompanied among the willows, where the only company on offer was sparrows and the smell of wet green things and the slow brown movement of the water. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes, seated on a weathered bench with her bonnet loosened against the mild morning air, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her, and did not need to turn to know precisely whose they were. "Your brother told me where to find you," Rothmere said, coming to stand beside her at the rail overlooking the water, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the space of several inches he had left, with evident deliberateness, between them. "He seemed to think I would be disappointed by the location, given the grandeur of everywhere else you might have chosen to be found instead. I am not disappointed in the slightest." He held something out to her, the small paper parcel of needles she had given his mother, now wrapped in a strip of blue ribbon that had certainly not been there when Honora had first purchased it. "She wanted you to have these back," he said. "She says a gift given without expectation of return ought to be returned in kind, once its purpose has been served, and that this constitutes an inviolable principle of hers. Though I confess I do not entirely follow the logic, I rarely do where my mother's principles are concerned. She is never once troubled to explain them fully, on the theory, I believe, that unearned wisdom is wasted wisdom." Honora took the small parcel, turning it over in her gloved hands, absurdly moved by so modest a thing, returned with such evident ceremony. "You could simply have kept them," she said. "They were a gift. I did not attach conditions." "I am aware," he said. "That is rather the point my mother is making, though she would express it a great deal more elegantly than I have just managed. A gift given without conditions is worth returning precisely because it was given without them. Anything given in expectation of recompense is merely a transaction wearing a gift's clothing, and my mother has spent 60 years developing a considerable talent for spotting the difference. He turned then, and the winter had gone entirely out of his gray eyes, replaced by something rawer and more careful than she had yet seen from him. I have spent 11 years watching people perform sincerity at me, Miss Vane. I know the shape of it now. The particular practice paused before a compliment lands, the way a woman's eyes traveled to my title before they ever quite reach my face, the careful arithmetic behind every apparently spontaneous remark. I did not think until very recently that I would recognize the genuine article when I finally encountered it. I recognized it in you before you had spoken 10 words to me, standing over an old woman on a shop floor with your sleeves already dusty from kneeling. That is not a proposal, Honora said, when she trusted her voice to remain steady. No, he agreed, with something almost like a smile. I intend to do this properly, in due course. Call upon your brother, ask his permission like a man with manners, however little either the request or the man himself may deserve the courtesy. I did not want you to hear the whole of it first inside a formal request delivered in someone else's drawing room, performed for an audience of interested relations. I wanted you to hear it here, honestly, in a place where neither of us is required to perform anything at all for anyone watching. They stood together at the rail for a long while after that, saying very little of consequence, watching the brown water slide past beneath the willows. And Honora found, to her own considerable surprise, that the silence between them felt entirely unlike the silences she had grown accustomed to in London drawing rooms. Not the strained, effortful silence of two people searching for something safe to say, but something closer to companionship, unhurried and entirely without agenda. Tell me about your father, she said eventually, because it seemed, somehow, the natural question to ask a man who had spoken of inheriting weight before he was old enough to carry it properly. Rothmere was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He was a difficult man, he said at last. Not cruel, precisely, merely absent in the particular way wealthy men often are, present at dinner and entirely elsewhere in every way that mattered. He mortgaged half the estate to fund a series of investments that came to nothing, and left the mess for me to untangle before I had properly finished mourning him, which I have come to understand was rather the point. He did not believe in leaving a son time to grieve before requiring him to work. I spent the first 3 years after his death simply learning which of our tenant farms were solvent and which were not, which debts could be renegotiated and which required immediate settlement, which of our so-called friends had only ever been friends of the fortune rather than the family. It was not a gentle education. And your mother? My mother, he said, and this time the almost smile reached his eyes properly. Spent those same 3 years alternately grieving my father with genuine sincerity. Whatever his failings, she loved him, in her way, and scheming to find me a wife who would not simply compound the very problems I was working to solve. I believe she has interviewed, by her own account, no fewer than 40 women in the guise of one servant or another over the past 2 seasons alone. You are the first she has approved of, unreservedly. I confess I did not entirely believe such a thing was possible until I watched it happen. Honora laughed, despite herself, at the image of the formidable dowager marquess conducting a decade-long covert investigation into the moral character of London's eligible women, and Rothmere, watching her laugh, seemed for a moment entirely content simply to observe it, as though the sound itself were something rare and worth cataloging. I should tell you, Honora said when her laughter had subsided, that my own family's situation is not so very different from what you describe, in its essentials, if considerably smaller in scale. My father died in debt. He never fully explained to any of us, and my brother has spent every year since trying to manage obligations he does not entirely understand and cannot entirely settle. I do not say this to solicit your pity or your fortune. I say it because I think you should know, before this goes any further, that I come to you without artifice, but also without the illusion that my family is disinterested in the outcome. Edmund would very much like me to marry well, Lord Rothmere, and I would be lying if I claimed his desperation played no part in my presence at your ball last evening. I am aware, Rothmere said. I made inquiries, Miss Vane, before I ever sent that invitation. I do not extend rare courtesies without understanding precisely what circumstances surround the person receiving them. I know your brother's situation. I know it is not dissimilar to circumstances I have encountered many times before, in families considerably less honest than yours has proven about the fact of it. What I do not believe, what I have watched you demonstrate, twice now in a dress shop and in a ballroom, is that you yourself are motivated by any of it. There is a considerable difference, Miss Vane, between a family desperate for a match and a woman willing to manufacture affection in order to secure one. I have met a great many of the latter. I begin to suspect exactly one of the former. They parted that morning with nothing formally settled between them, and yet Honora walked home with a lightness she had not carried in years, a lightness that lasted, in fact, almost precisely 11 days before the whole of it came crashing down around her with a violence she had not seen coming, and should, perhaps, have anticipated all along. The 11 days that followed were, Honora would later reflect, the happiest she had known since her mother's death, though happiness of that particular unguarded kind had always made her suspicious, as though joy, left unwatched, might curdle the moment one turned one's back on it. Rothmere called twice more that week, each visit conducted with a propriety so scrupulous that even Charlotte, watching from the drawing-room window with an eagle's attention to detail, could find nothing in his conduct to criticize. He took Honora walking in the park on a fine afternoon, where they were seen, deliberately, Honora suspected, though he never admitted as much, by no fewer than 3 separate parties of London's most enthusiastic gossips, ensuring that by the following morning the entire ton understood, in broad and increasingly embellished outline, that the reclusive Marquess of Rothmere had developed a marked preference for Miss Honora Vane, spinster, 26, of no particular fortune, and appeared entirely unbothered by any of the facts that ought, by every room had ever written, to have disquieted. You do realize, Prudence said, over their now customary Thursday tea, that half the drawing-rooms in Mayfair are currently engaged in furious speculation as to what, precisely, you have done to secure such attention. I have heard no fewer than 4 theories this week alone. One holds that you are secretly an heiress in disguise, testing suitors for their sincerity in a scheme borrowed, apparently, from a novel. Another holds that you have compromising knowledge of some family secret, and are extorting his attentions through blackmail, which I confess is the theory I find most entertaining, given how thoroughly it misunderstands your character. A third, and this one troubles me rather more, holds that the marquise has simply lost her wits in her advancing years, and Rothmere is humoring her out of filial duty, rather than any genuine preference of his own. And the fourth? Honora asked, though she suspected she already knew. The fourth, Prudence said more gently, holds that he genuinely prefers you, precisely as you are, and that London simply cannot conceive of such a thing happening to a woman who has not spent a decade cultivating beauty and connections in pursuit of exactly this outcome. I confess I find that theory both the most likely and the most difficult for certain parties to forgive you for. She did not need to specify which parties she meant. Cordelia Pemberton had not been seen at any gathering. Honora attended in the days since the ball, though reports of her fury, relayed through the reliable channel of servants' gossip, which traveled through London's kitchens with considerably more speed and accuracy than any drawing-room conversation, suggested that she had taken to her bed for 2 full days following the humiliation of the refused apology, and had emerged from her confinement in a mood her own mother reportedly described, in a moment of rare candor to a sympathetic friend, as not to be borne, as nami. What Honora did not know, what she would not learn until considerably later, and only then in fragments, pieced together from other people's careless remarks, was that Mrs. Pemberton had not spent those 2 days idle. She had spent them instead in the company of an old and useful acquaintance, Lady Vermont, a widow of 35 whose late husband had left her a comfortable independence, and whose ambitions, since his death 3 years prior, had settled with singular focus upon the Marquess of Rothmere, whom she had known slightly in his father's lifetime and had watched, with mounting frustration, decline every overture she had made in the 2 seasons since his mourning ended. It was Lady Vermont, elegant and watchful in deep blue, whom Honora had noticed observing her from across the ballroom on the night of the refused apology, though she had not, at the time, understood the significance of the attention. "She is a dangerous woman," the Dowager Marchioness said, some days later, When Honora, now a regular enough visitor to Rothmere House that the footman no longer troubled to announce her formally, mentioned the encounter in passing, describing the elegant stranger in blue whose gaze had lingered rather too long. Vermont. I know her well, and I like her not at all, though I confess she is clever enough that I have never caught her in anything I could name outright as malice. She wanted Gabriel for herself, once his mourning ended, and made no particular secret of it in circles where such things could be discussed without consequence. He declined her, gently but entirely, some 18 months ago, and I do not believe she has forgiven either of us for it since. A woman like that does not simply abandon an ambition merely because it has been refused, Miss Vane. She sets it aside and waits for a more useful occasion to revive it. What occasion could she possibly find now? I do not know, the Marchioness admitted, and for the first time since Honora had known her, something like genuine worry crossed the old woman's face. But I have lived a great many years in this particular jungle, my dear, and I have learned that when a predator goes quiet, it is rarely because she has lost interest in the hunt. The warning, delivered so plainly, ought perhaps to have prepared Honora for what followed. It did not. Nothing, she would later reflect, could truly have prepared her for the particular calculated cruelty of what came next, nor for how swiftly an entire fortnight's tentative happiness could be dismantled by a single well-placed rumor, delivered to precisely the right ears at precisely the right moment. It began, as these things generally do, with something almost true. Honora's father, in the final years before his death, had indeed fallen into an entanglement he had never fully explained to his family, not the ordinary accumulation of gaming debts and unpaid tailor's bills that constituted the whole of what Edmund had ever disclosed to his sister, but something older and more particular, a debt of honor owed to a man named Josiah Thorne, a merchant of no particular family, who had, by all evidence, once extended the elder Mr. Vane a substantial private loan under circumstances neither man had ever committed fully to paper. Thorne had died some years past. His son, inheriting both the business and whatever remained unresolved of his father's private affairs, had apparently mentioned, in a moment of idle complaint, to an acquaintance who happened, through several further degrees of separation, to be acquainted with Lady Vermont, that the Vane family had never properly settled the sum owed, and that he had, on occasion, considered pursuing the matter through more formal channels. It was a small thing in itself, an old, unglamorous debt, the kind that afflicted half the families of the ton in one form or another, rarely spoken of and never, under ordinary circumstances, considered a matter for public comment. Lady Vermont, with the patient surgical precision of a woman who had spent 18 months waiting for exactly this sort of opportunity, transformed it into something considerably uglier. By the time the story reached Honora, relayed, with visible distress, by Prudence, who had heard it first from her own mother's former companion, who had heard it from a lady's maid, who had heard it, ultimately, from someone close enough to Lady Vermont's own household to have overheard the original conversation, it had grown into something scarcely recognizable as the truth from which it had sprung, the whispered version making its way through diquatre pupil Ebert, to other moderate of. But Marta's waterbavet died not merely in ordinary debt, but what an althurvitherrath or fraud, having borrowed sums from Josiah Thorne under false pretenses he never intended to honor. That Edmund Vane, far from struggling honestly with an inherited burden, had known of the fraud all along and had deliberately concealed it. And this was the detail calculated, with real cruelty to strike closest to the bone, that Honora herself had orchestrated her entire acquaintance with the Dowager March. Through her, with Rothmays, had borstkandideerd her partij for the bebaron Countess Bedens, but thadel de beberdere. It was, Honora reflected later, almost admirable in its architecture, built from just enough genuine fact to resist easy denial, twisted just enough to make her own honesty, her own refusal to flatter or perform, retroactively suspicious. If she had been so artless as she appeared, the whispers reasoned, how had she managed to secure, within a single fortnight, the attention of the most eligible and most guarded man in London? Surely artlessness that effective could only be its own kind of art. It isn't true, Honora said to Prudence in the small sunlit parlor where she had once discussed nothing more consequential than borrowed novels, her hands cold despite the warmth of the fire. None of it. Not the fraud, not the scheme, none of it. My father's debt was a private matter between two men who trusted each other and were both, I believe, honest in their intentions, whatever went unwritten between them. I did not know the Marchioness was the Marchioness when I helped her. I did not know Rothmere existed at all until he introduced himself on the pavement. I know, Prudence said, gripping her friend's hands tightly. I know it, Honora, and anyone who has ever spent 5 minutes in your company would know it too. But you must understand, the story does not need to be true. It need only be interesting enough to repeat, and cruel enough to enjoy repeating. London has wanted for 11 days now some explanation for how a spinster with no fortune managed to capture Rothmere's attention that does not require admitting the plain and uncomfortable possibility that character alone accomplished it. Lady Vermont has simply given them the explanation they were already hoping for. The question that occupied every anxious hour of the following 2 days, the question Honora turned over relentlessly, sleeplessly, unable to set it down, was not whether London would believe the story. London, she understood well enough by now, would believe whatever proved most entertaining, and would abandon the belief just as readily the moment something more entertaining presented itself. The question that truly frightened her was whether Rothmere would believe it. Whether a man who had spent 11 years cultivating suspicion of every apparently sincere overture made toward him would, faced with a story constructed with such careful, plausible cruelty, finally conclude that his own hard-won trust had been misplaced after all. She did not have long to wait for her answer, though the answer, when it came, was not at all what she had feared. Nor was it entirely what she had hoped. Rothmere came to the house himself, the very evening the story reached its fullest, most damaging circulation, arriving without the courtesy of advance notice and with an expression Honora had not seen on him before. Not cold, precisely, but guarded in a way that felt, after 11 days of unguarded honesty between them, like watching a door close that she had believed, foolishly perhaps, had been left permanently open. Edmund, to his credit, did not attempt to manage the interview, or insert himself between them with the sort of anxious calculation Honora might, under different circumstances, have expected from him. He simply showed Rothmere into the small drawing room and withdrew, leaving the two of them alone with a discretion Honora had not known her brother possessed. I will not insult either of us by pretending I do not know why you have come, Honora said, before Rothmere could speak, standing very straight beside the cold fireplace, her hands folded tightly enough that her knuckles had gone pale. You have heard the story Lady Vermont has taken such evident care to construct, and you have come to discover for yourself how much of it might be true. I have heard it, Rothmere said. I do not entirely believe it, but I confess I have also heard this same afternoon that your father's debt to Josiah Thorne is a genuine matter of record, unresolved to this day, and that Thorne's son has indeed spoken of pursuing formal recourse. That part, at least, is not invention. His jaw was tight, his voice carefully controlled in a way that told Honora more than his words did about the effort the control was costing him. I did not ask you to account for your father's private affairs, Miss Vane. I ask only, and I would ask this of anyone in my position, given everything I have spent 11 years learning to guard against, whether you knew, when we first spoke, precisely who my mother was, whether any part of what has passed between us since has been calculated rather than genuine. The question, however gently framed, landed like a blow, and Honora felt something in her chest go very cold and very still. You are asking, she said slowly, whether I lied to you. I am asking whether I have been a fool, he said, and for the first time she heard beneath the careful control something that sounded almost like genuine fear. The fear, she understood suddenly, of a man who had spent 11 years protecting himself from exactly this outcome and had, against every hard-learned instinct, allowed himself to hope it might not repeat itself this time. I have been deceived before, Miss Vane, by women considerably more practiced at deception than the story suggests you might be, and I have spent a great many years afterward despising myself for not seeing it sooner. I do not ask this question because I believe the answer will be yes. I ask it because I find I cannot simply assume the answer is no, however much I wish I could, without first hearing you say it plainly, and watching your face while you say it. Honora felt, in that moment, two entirely opposing impulses war within her. The impulse to soften, to reassure, to give him whatever plain denial would restore the easy trust of the past 11 days, and beneath it, rising with a heat that surprised her, something far sharper and more wounded, the old familiar instinct of 6 years spent proving herself to a world that had never once extended her the benefit of the doubt, and the sudden, bitter recognition that she had believed, had genuinely foolishly believed, That Rothmere, of all people, might prove different? No, she said finally evenly, though her voice shook slightly on the single word. I did not know who your mother was. I have told you this already, on the pavement, on the morning by the river. I have told you the truth of it at every opportunity, because I have never once, in the whole of our acquaintance, found it necessary to tell you anything else. I understand, Lord Rothmere, that you have been deceived before, and I am genuinely sorry for whatever wound that experience left in you. But I will not spend the remainder of this conversation, or any conversation, defending my honesty against a story invented by a woman who wanted you for herself and could not bear to watch you choose otherwise. If 11 days of my company have not been sufficient evidence of my character, I do not believe any further protestation on my part will supply what is lacking. You will either trust what you have already seen of me, or you will not, and I find I would rather know now, plainly, which it is to be, than spend a single further hour wondering. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, she thought, and beneath it something that might almost have been respect, though it was buried too deep in that moment beneath his own visible turmoil for her to be entirely certain. I need time, he said finally, not to determine whether I trust you, Miss Vane. I find, even now, that some part of me trusts you entirely and resents the rest of myself considerably for requiring anything further. But I have a family name that has been dragged through enough scandal in my father's lifetime to last several generations, and I owe it to my mother, if no one else, to understand precisely what is true before I act in a manner that cannot be undone. I intend to speak with Thorn myself. I intend to learn the whole of it, from the source, rather than from whatever version Lady Vermont has seen fit to circulate. I ask only that you grant me the time to do so properly. And in the meanwhile? In the meanwhile, he said, and here for just a moment. The careful control cracked enough to let something rawer through. I would ask that you not doubt, whatever comes of this, that these past 11 days have been the first entirely honest ones I have known since my father died. Whatever I discover from Thorn, that much will remain true regardless. He left without further ceremony, and Honora stood alone in the small, cold drawing-room for a long while afterward, uncertain whether what she felt most keenly was hope or grief, and finding, in the end, that the two had become so thoroughly entangled she could no longer easily separate them. She did not attend any social gatherings for the following 4 days. She told Charlotte she was unwell, which was near enough to true that the lie cost her little, and spent the days instead in the small garden behind the house, or walking the mile to the river where no one from the ton would think to look for her, turning over every moment of the past 11 days with the relentless, unforgiving scrutiny of a woman searching for the exact instant she had allowed herself to hope too much. Too soon, against every lesson 6 years of London had ever troubled to teach her. You did nothing wrong, Prudence said. On the third of these days, finding Honora at the river and sitting beside her without invitation, in the manner of old friends who no longer require one. I know you believe, somewhere beneath all this misery, that you ought to have managed the conversation differently, softened your answer, reassured him more thoroughly, given him whatever comfort would have settled his doubt more quickly. But Honora, listen to me. If a man requires you to perform certainty in order to earn his trust, the trust was never truly on offer in the first place. You told him the truth. That he required time to verify it himself is not a failure on your part. It may, in fact, be the very quality that makes him worth the waiting. And if he does not come back, then he was never the man his mother believed him to be, Prudence said simply, and you will have lost nothing you ever truly possessed. But Honora, I do not believe that is what will happen. I have watched that man dance 3 sets with you in front of the whole of London, and I have watched since how he looks at you when he believes no one else is paying attention. A man does not unlearn that in 4 days, whatever doubts a jealous widow manages to plant in the meanwhile. Honora wanted, badly, to believe her. She did not entirely succeed, though she found, in the days that followed, that Prudence's steady, unwavering presence made the waiting considerably more bearable than it would otherwise have been, a fact she would remember gratefully for the whole of her life afterward, long after the events of that particular fortnight had faded into the comfortable, well-worn shape of a story told at family dinners. Rothmere spent those same 4 days in considerably more active pursuit of the truth than Honora, in her misery, credited him with undertaking. He called first upon Josiah Thorn's son. a plain, sensible man of business named William Thorne, who received the Marquess of Rothmere in his modest city office with the wary courtesy of a man unaccustomed to receiving noble visitors and uncertain what such an unusual call might portend. What Rothmere learned there differed, in every essential particular, from the version London had chosen to believe. "There was no fraud, my lord," Thorne said, laying out for Rothmere's inspection a small bundle of correspondence he had kept, out of sentiment more than legal necessity, since his father's death. "My father lent Mr. Vane the sum in question as a friend, not as a creditor in the strict sense. The two of them had known each other for years, through some mutual interest in horses, of all things. And my father never troubled to draw up formal papers, trusting Mr. Vane's word entirely. It was, if I am honest, rather foolish of him from a business perspective. But he was not a man who calculated friendship in ledgers. Mr. Vane died before the sum could be repaid, and his son, Mr. Edmund Vane, has written to me twice since, offering what partial payment his circumstances allow and asking for patience regarding the remainder. I have granted it. I did, some months back, complain of the delay to an acquaintance in a moment of impatience. I now regret considerably, given what appears to have been made of the remark since. But fraud, my lord? No, never that. Whatever my father lent, he lent freely to a man he trusted, and I have no complaint against the family beyond the ordinary frustration of a debt collected more slowly than one might prefer. It was, Rothmere reflected as he left Thorne's office, precisely the sort of unglamorous, entirely human truth that Lady Vermont's carefully constructed rumor had counted upon no one troubling to investigate too closely. A private matter between two men, neither villain nor victim, twisted in the retelling into something it had never been. His second call, made that same afternoon, was considerably less cordial. He found Lady Vermont at home, receiving in a drawing-room decorated, he noted with some private distaste, in a style calculated to suggest wealth considerably beyond what her late husband's modest fortune actually supported, and came to the point with a directness that left no room for the practiced deflections she had clearly prepared. "I've spoken with William Thorne," he said, declining the seat she offered, declining also the tea, declining every small courtesy that might have softened what he had come to say. "I know precisely what was said, and precisely what was invented in the telling. I would ask you, Lady Vermont, what you hope to accomplish by it, except that I already know the answer, and find I have no patience remaining to hear you deny it." "I am certain I do not know what you mean, my lord." Her composure was admirable, he had to admit, even as he watched, beneath it, the first thin cracks of genuine alarm. "I merely repeated what I had heard, as anyone might. I hardly invented. You embellished a private debt into a public fraud," Rothmere said, "and a spontaneous act of kindness into a calculated scheme, and you did so, I believe, because I declined your own overtures 18 months ago, and you have never entirely forgiven either of us the refusal. I will not pursue this further in a manner that would drag your name through the same mud you have attempted to drag through Miss Vane's, Lady Vermont, because I have no wish to make my mother's season more entertaining for London's gossips than it has already become. But I will tell you this plainly, and I trust you will understand I do not make idle statements. If I hear so much as a whisper of Miss Vane's name attached to any further invention, from you or from anyone in your acquaintance, I will make certain the whole truth of Thorne's actual testimony reaches every drawing-room your rumor has already poisoned, along with a full accounting of precisely who constructed the poison and why. I trust I have made myself understood." He left her drawing-room without waiting for a reply, and Lady Vermont, by every subsequent account, never again attempted to interfere in the affairs of Miss Honora Vane, having discovered, rather too late, that the Marquess of Rothmere's guarded nature, once genuinely engaged on someone's behalf, made a considerably more formidable adversary than his previous reputation for cold indifference had ever suggested. He came to the Vane household on the 5th morning, not through the front door with its formal calling card ceremony, but around by the small side gate that led into the garden where Toby had once, weeks before, directed him toward the river. Arriving unannounced, in the gray early light before the household had properly stirred, and found Honora already awake, seated on the same weathered bench among her mother's roses, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill, unable to sleep for the 5th night running. Chill, unable to sleep for the 5th night running. She looked up at the sound of the gate, and something in her chest, which had spent 5 days clenched tight against the possibility of disappointment, loosened all at once at the sight of him. "I spoke with Thorn," Rothamir said, before she could ask, crossing the small garden to stand before her. "There was no fraud. There was a debt, freely lent between friends, unresolved through nothing more sinister than the ordinary difficulty of settling accounts after a death, and a careless remark twisted by a woman with her own reasons for wanting me to believe the worst of you. I know the whole of it now, Miss Vane, from the source itself, and I have made certain the source of the invention will trouble you no further." "You went yourself," Honora said. "You did not simply send a solicitor or a letter." "I did not think the truth of this particular matter belonged to a solicitor to uncover," he said. "I thought it belonged to me, since it was my own doubt that required settling, and my own doubt that I owed you the courage to resolve properly rather than at a comfortable remove." He knelt then, unexpectedly, on the damp grass before her bench, heedless of what the gesture would do to his fine trousers, and took her cold hands in his. "I am sorry," he said, and the words cost him something visible she could see, a man unaccustomed to the exercise of open apology. "Not for asking whether it was true. I think, given what I have survived before, I could not have done otherwise, and I do not believe you would truly wish me to be a man who accepts every claim on faith without troubling to verify it. But I am sorry for how long I allowed the verifying to take, when some truer part of me already knew from the very first moment precisely what the answer would be. I have spent 11 years guarding myself so carefully against deception that I very nearly let genuine honesty walk away from me, rather than risk the guarding proving, for once, unnecessary. I do not intend to make that particular mistake twice." Honora, looking down at him kneeling in the wet grass among her mother's unfashionable roses, found that whatever careful composure she had maintained through 5 sleepless nights dissolved entirely at once, and she was, to her own considerable embarrassment, crying, not from grief now, but from the sheer relief of 5 days' tension finally, properly released. "You have ruined a perfectly good pair of trousers," she managed, through the tears, and heard him laugh. A real laugh, low and startled and entirely unguarded, the first she had heard from him since the ball. "A small price," he said, "for what I hope I am about to receive in exchange," and drew her hands to his lips, and Honora understood, in that moment, kneeling roses and ruined trousers and all, that whatever came next between them would be built on ground considerably more solid than 11 easy days had managed to establish alone, ground tested now, and found, on examination, entirely sound. He came to call properly 2 days later, in the formal manner Edmund had been anxiously anticipating since the very morning after the ball, and the whole household arranged itself, at Charlotte's frantic direction, into a tableau of respectable prosperity that fooled absolutely no one, least of all the man it was meant to impress. "I understand," Rothamir said. Once seated in the good parlor with tea, he had no intention of drinking, addressing Edmund with the same pleasant, immovable authority he had employed in every previous negotiation of his life. "That you have views regarding my intentions toward your sister, Mr. Vane, and I understand further that you have, perhaps, formed certain expectations regarding a settlement that might accompany them." Edmund, sensing at last the opportunity he had spent a fortnight anticipating, leaned forward with poorly disguised eagerness. "Naturally, my lord, a settlement befitting the connection would be entirely appropriate, and I should be glad to discuss particulars at your convenience." "There will be no settlement discussion," Rothamir said, in the same pleasant tone, though something beneath it had gone considerably harder, "beyond what I intend to arrange directly for your sister's own independent use, which will be substantial, and which will be hers alone, under no circumstances accessible to you or to any other member of this family. I have fortune enough for 3 estates, Mr. Vane, and no need whatsoever of your sister's dowry, which I understand to be modest, and which I understand you to have already spent, in your own imagination, at least twice over on obligations that are, properly speaking, your concern and not hers. I am aware, further, of the debt owed to the estate of Josiah Thorn. I have already arranged, through my own solicitor, to settle the remaining balance in full, not as a gift to you, but as a courtesy to your sister, who ought not to enter this marriage with her family's obligations hanging still unresolved over her head." Edmund's face cycled rapidly through several emotions. Relief chief among them, Honora thought, watching from the doorway where she had been permitted, at Charlotte's insistence, to observe rather than participate directly in a conversation ostensibly concerning her own future. followed swiftly by something more calculating, as though already contemplating what further advantage might yet be extracted from so generous a connection. Rothmere, watching the same calculation cross Edmund's face, addressed it directly, without waiting for it to fully form into words. "Let me be entirely plain, Mr. Vane. Since I have found plainness generally saves considerable time and misunderstanding in matters of business, and I consider this a matter of business as much as it is a matter of family. If I learn, at any point after this marriage, that you have attempted to extract further sums from your sister's new connections, or to trade upon her position for your own social or financial advancement, you will find the Marquess of Rothmere a considerably less agreeable relation than whatever generosity I have shown you today might presently suggest. I do not make threats lightly, and I do not make them twice. Do we understand each other?" Edmund, for what Honora believed to be the first genuine occasion in her memory of him, found himself entirely without a ready response, and managed, after a long, uncomfortable pause, only a stiff nod and a murmured assurance that, of course, naturally, nothing of the sort had ever been his intention. An assurance both men in the room understood to be considerably less than fully honest, and which Rothmere accepted regardless, with the weary patience of a man who had encountered the type before and did not expect virtue, only sufficient detergents. It was later that same afternoon, alone with Honora in the small garden behind the house, a location that was rapidly becoming, she reflected, the true site of every consequential conversation in their entire acquaintance, rather more so than any ballroom or drawing-room London had to offer, that Rothmere produced the small ring that would, in time, become the physical center of the story London told about them for years afterward. "It was my grandmother's," he said, pressing it into her palm, old gold, worn, soft, and thin with age. A single sapphire set simply, without the ostentation Honora might have expected from a family of Rothmere's wealth. She chose her own husband against her family's considerable objections. He was a younger son with no particular fortune of his own at the time, and her family had rather hoped for someone grander. And by every account I have ever heard, never once regretted the choice, not even in the difficult early years before his elder brother's death made the match retroactively respectable in society's eyes. "My mother thought you should have it," she said, and I quote her precisely because I do not believe I could improve upon the sentiment, that any woman willing to defy a countess in a dress shop had earned the ring of a woman who once defied an entire family for love. Honora turned the ring over in the fading afternoon light, feeling its worn, familiar weight settle into her palm, as though it had been waiting there for her specifically, and found she could not, for a long moment, trust herself to speak. "I have one condition," she said finally, when she had recovered sufficient composure. "Before I answer you properly, Lord Rothmere, I would have you hear it plainly, so that neither of us enters this arrangement under any illusion about the terms. I am listening. I will not disappear into your household as an ornament," she said, "however grand the household or however genuine the affection that brings me into it. I have spent 6 years learning to survive on my own judgment, in circumstances that offered me very little else to rely upon, and I do not intend to surrender that judgment entirely at the altar, however willingly I intend to surrender other things. I will keep my own correspondence, unopened by anyone but myself. I will have a room in your house that is genuinely mine, not merely lent to me at your convenience, but mine, to arrange and occupy exactly as I see fit, with a lock upon the door, if I should ever want one, though I hope I never shall. And I will expect whatever disagreements arise between us in the years ahead, for I do not doubt they will arise, since I have never yet met two people of genuine character who did not occasionally disagree. That you will hear my objections as the honest counsel of an equal partner, and not as the inconvenient temperament of a wife to be managed into agreement." Rothmere was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she had come to recognize over the past weeks as his particular way of taking something seriously enough to consider it fully before responding. "Good," he said finally, and there was no hesitation whatsoever in the word, only something that looked remarkably like relief. "I was rather hoping you would insist upon precisely that, and I confess I had begun composing my own version of the same speech before you ever opened your mouth, in the event you had not thought to raise it yourself. A wife who agreed with everything I said would bore me within the month, Miss Vane, and I have had quite enough of boredom to last several lifetimes. I do not want an ornament. I have never wanted an ornament, whatever 11 years of eligible women assume to the contrary. I want precisely what you have just described, with every condition attached, and I am entirely prepared to hold up my own end of the bargain. Disagreements and all." She laughed and let him slide the worn sapphire ring onto her finger, and thought, watching it catch the last of the afternoon light, that this, unglamorous and honest and negotiated with the plain, careful precision of two people who had both learned, the hard way, not to trust easy promises, was worth considerably more than every grand romantic gesture London's novels had ever taught her to expect, and worth, moreover, every single year of waiting it had cost her to arrive at it. The betrothal was announced formally within the week, in a notice so brief and unadorned that several of London's more excitable papers felt compelled to supplement it with speculation of their own, and the city's collective attention, having spent a fortnight entertained by Lady Vermont's cruelty, pivoted with the same fickle enthusiasm toward marveling at the match itself. Opinion divided along predictable lines. There were those, a decided majority, Honora suspected, though she made a point of not inquiring too closely into the exact proportions, who found the whole affair a delightfully romantic curiosity. The reclusive marquess, finally undone by a woman's society, had long since written off, and repeated the story of the dress shop and the needles with increasing embellishment at every dinner table in Mayfair. There were others, smaller in number but considerably louder in the telling, who muttered that Rothmere might have done better for himself, that 26 and no fortune to speak of was hardly the match his father would have arranged for him, had the elder marquess lived to arrange it. Honora found to her own mild surprise that she cared very little for either camp. She had spent 6 years bracing herself against London's opinion, and discovered now that the bracing had become such habit she scarcely noticed its continued necessity, whatever direction the opinion happened to blow. It was the dowager marchioness who proposed the country house party, some 3 weeks into the engagement, over one of the increasingly frequent teas Honora now took at Rothmere House, in something approaching an official capacity. "We shall remove to Ashworth Park for a fortnight before the wedding," the marchioness announced, in the tone of a woman who considered the matter already settled and was merely informing the room of the decision rather than soliciting agreement to it. "I have grown thoroughly tired of London's air, which I am convinced grows more poisonous by the season, and I should like the two of you to have some proper time together away from the city's attention before the wedding itself descends upon us with all its attendant nonsense. We shall invite a modest party, nothing so grand as the ball, merely 30 or 40 of our closer acquaintance, enough for pleasant company without descending into spectacle." 30 or 40, Rothmere repeated, with the particular dryness Honora had come to recognize as his response to his mother's persistent inability to distinguish modest from anything else. "You have an interesting notion of modesty, Mother." "I have an accurate notion of what constitutes tolerable company for a fortnight in the country, which is rather a different calculation than the one you are attempting," the marchioness said, entirely unmoved. "And I have already sent the invitations, so the point is somewhat academic in any case." Ashworth Park, when Honora arrived there some days later in the Rothmere carriage, proved to be considerably more beautiful than she had allowed herself to imagine. A great gray house of mellow stone, softened by 2 centuries of ivy and careful gardening, set among rolling parkland that fell away toward a lake glittering silver in the afternoon light. It was, she understood immediately, a house built not for display but for living, its grandeur worn comfortably rather than performed, and she felt, stepping down from the carriage into the warm country air, something loosen in her chest that she had not fully realized was still held tight. "It is not what I expected," she admitted to Rothmere, as they walked together through the formal gardens on her first evening, the last light turning the lake to copper. "What did you expect?" "Something colder, I think. Grander and less kind. Rothmere House in London is beautiful, but it did not feel." She searched for the word. "Lived in, I suppose. This does. My mother has kept it exactly as it was in my grandmother's time," Rothmere said. "She says London houses are for performing wealth, and country houses are for actually possessing it, and she has never once seen the point of confusing the two purposes. I have always agreed with her, though I confess I spend so little time here that I sometimes forget how much I have missed it, until I arrive and remember all at once." The party assembled over the following days proved, despite the marchioness's protestations of modesty, to number closer to 50 than 40 by the time the last carriage had disgorged its occupants, and included, to Honora's considerable pleasure, Both Prudence Holloway, invited, Honora suspected at Rothmere's own quiet insistence, having noted his betrothed's evident fondness for her friend, and Julian Faircroft, whose invitation the Marquess explained with a shrug that suggested she found his company amusing to justify his presence regardless of any deeper strategic purpose. It also included, considerably less welcome but impossible to exclude without occasioning further gossip, Mrs. Pemberton and Cordelia, whose invitation had been extended. Honora learned later, with some private amusement, that the Marquess's calculated cruelty, precisely because excluding them would have suggested lingering resentment, whereas including them and watching Cordelia forced to smile through an entire fortnight of Honora's evident happiness, constituted a considerably more thorough and satisfying revenge than any direct confrontation could have achieved. "My mother," Rothmere observed dryly, watching Cordelia's strained countenance across the lawn on the second morning, "does not believe in half measures where satisfaction is concerned." Julian Faircroft and Prudence Holloway, thrown together by proximity and a shared talent for observing the assembled company with matching expressions of amused detachment, discovered within the first 2 days a rapport that Honora watched develop with considerable private delight, though neither of them, in the earliest stages, seemed entirely aware of what was happening between them. "He is not at all what I expected," Prudence confided, on the third evening, as the two women walked together along the lakeshore while the rest of the party dressed for dinner. "I had assumed from his reputation a man of no particular substance beneath the fashionable exterior. I find instead a man who reads considerably more than he admits to in company, and hides a genuinely sharp understanding of people behind a very deliberate performance of foppishness. I confess I do not entirely know what to make of the discovery." "I think," Honora said, "that you should make rather a great deal of it, if the look on your face when you speak of him is any indication." Prudence colored, and changed the subject with a speed that told Honora everything the change of subject was meant to conceal, and Honora, watching her oldest friend's carefully guarded happiness begin, tentatively, to unfold, found herself hoping, fiercely, and with rather less of her customary caution than she generally permitted herself, that this fortnight might yet prove to hold more than one happy ending among its assembled company. The fourth day brought an archery contest upon the great south lawn, arranged by the Marchioness with the transparent purpose of giving her guests something to occupy their mornings that did not involve idle gossip in the drawing-room, and it was there, before the assembled company of nearly 50 guests, that Cordelia Pemberton's carefully maintained composure finally, publicly, and rather spectacularly failed her. She'd spent the preceding 3 days performing a version of gracious good humor so effortful that even her own mother had begun, by the second evening, to visibly wince at its strain, smiling through gritted teeth at every mention of the upcoming wedding, complimenting Honora's gown with a warmth so transparently false that several of the other guests had taken to exchanging amused glances behind their fans whenever the performance was required. But archery, it transpired, was a pursuit at which Cordelia had genuinely excelled in the schoolroom, one of the few accomplishments she had cultivated for its own sake rather than for its display value in a ballroom, and the prospect of a contest she might actually win seemed, for a morning, to restore something of her old confidence. She was, in fact, remarkably skilled, striking the target's center twice running while several of the gentlemen in attendance managed nothing better than the outer rings, and Honora, watching from beneath a parasol with genuine, unguarded admiration, found herself applauding with entire sincerity. "You are very good at this," Honora said, when Cordelia came to retrieve her arrows near where Honora stood. Cordelia, flushed with the small triumph, and evidently forgetting for a moment the careful hostility she had maintained toward Honora throughout the fortnight, allowed herself a genuine smile. "My governess said I had a natural eye for it. I used to practice for hours. Before my mother decided archery did nothing to advance my prospects and redirected my time toward the pianoforte instead, which I have never enjoyed nearly so much." The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by something more guarded. "Not that it matters now. A woman is only ever as accomplished as her marriage allows her to remain interested in being." It was, Honora thought, the first entirely honest sentence she had ever heard Cordelia Pemberton speak, and she might have pursued the small opening further, might have found, in that unguarded moment, some path toward genuine understanding between them, had Mrs. Pemberton not arrived at that exact moment, with the brittle urgency of a woman who had overheard just enough of the exchange to find it alarming. "Cordelia," she said, seizing her daughter's arm with a grip, Honora recognized uncomfortably from the scene at Madame Yvette's shop weeks before. "Lord Ashby has asked most particularly after you. You must not waste the morning standing about with—" She stopped herself, visibly, from finishing the sentence with whatever unflattering term she had intended, substituting instead a tight "with the other guests," and steered her daughter away with a firmness that left no room for further conversation. It was that evening, at dinner, that the fragile peace shattered entirely. Mrs. Pemberton, seated near enough to the Marchioness to have overheard a private remark concerning the wedding settlements, a remark she had, by every account, deliberately strained to hear, chose the moment of a lull in the general conversation to raise, in tones pitched for maximum audience, a pointed observation regarding the unusual arrangement by which Rothmere had settled a substantial sum directly upon Honora, rather than through the customary channel of her brother's estate. "How very modern," Mrs. Pemberton said, with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "One does not often see a bride granted such independent means before she is even properly married. I confess I wonder what precedent it sets for a wife to hold her own fortune quite separate from her husband's authority. It seems almost, forgive me, almost as though the arrangement anticipates some future need for the lady to manage entirely on her own, which I should think a curious thing to plan for on the very eve of a happy marriage." The insinuation was not subtle. That Rothmere expected the marriage to fail, or that Honora herself had negotiated the arrangement with some eventual escape already in mind, and had landed, as intended, into a silence thick enough to taste. It was Cordelia, unexpectedly, who broke it. "Mother," she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried the particular clarity of a young woman who had, over the course of one long fortnight watching an engagement built on honesty rather than calculation, arrived at some private reckoning of her own. "I do not think that is a kind thing to say, or a fair one." Mrs. Pemberton turned to her daughter with an expression of pure astonishment, as though the table itself had spoken out of turn. "Cordelia, Lord Rothmere has settled money on Miss Vane because he trusts her judgment enough to let her keep it, which is rather more than can be said for most husbands in this room." Cordelia continued, her color rising but her voice steady, "And I think, having spent a fortnight watching them together, that the arrangement has nothing whatsoever to do with anticipating failure. I think it has to do with respect, which I confess I did not understand the shape of until I watched it demonstrated in front of me for 2 weeks running, and which I am rather ashamed to admit I had never once seen modeled at our own dinner table." She set down her fork, her hands trembling slightly, and looked directly at Honora down the length of the table. "Miss Vane, I believe I owe you the apology I refused, weeks ago, to mean properly. I am sorry, genuinely sorry, this time, not because I fear the consequence of withholding it, but because I have watched you, this fortnight, be nothing but honest and generous to a family that has given you every reason to be neither, and I find I can no longer pretend, even to myself, that my earlier cruelty was anything but small and frightened and unworthy of either us." The silence that followed this was of an entirely different quality than the one preceding it, not the taut, scandalized hush of gossip about to bloom, but something closer to genuine surprise, rippling quietly around the table as guests exchanged glances that acknowledged, without quite saying so aloud, that they had just witnessed something considerably rarer than a comeuppance. A genuine change of heart, offered without an audience's demand for it. Honora, recovering from her own surprise, rose slightly from her chair. "Thank you, Miss Pemberton," she said simply and warmly. "I accept your apology, and I mean that entirely." Mrs. Pemberton, robbed of the small cruelty she had engineered the evening to accomplish, and confronted instead with her own daughter's public repudiation of it, sat rigid and furious for the remainder of the meal, saying nothing further, while the conversation around her moved on with the particular relief of a company grateful to have avoided a scene, and grateful, too, for the unexpected grace note that had replaced it. It was not, Honora reflected later, the comeuppance she might once have imagined for Cordelia Pemberton, back in the earliest days of their acquaintance on the floor of Madame Yvette's shop. It was something better, not humiliation, but genuine reckoning, arrived at in Cordelia's own time and by her own conscience, rather than forced upon her by an audience's demand for spectacle, and Honora found she could not, in the end, have wished for anything more satisfying than that. The following morning, while most of the party slept late after the previous evening's unexpected drama, Rothmere took Honora out in a small gig to visit the tenant farms that made up the working heart of the estate. A part of his life, he explained, that he rarely troubled to show London acquaintances, since London found such matters tedious beyond enduring, but which he wanted her to see before the wedding made her mistress of it in truth. "This is Hollis Farm," he said, as they drew up before a low stone farmhouse where a weathered man of perhaps 60 came out to greet them with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "The Hollis family has worked this land for 4 generations. My father let the roof go 3 years without repair, arguing the expense against the return, and old Mr. Hollis never once complained of it to my face, though I learned afterward that his wife had taken in washing to make up the difference. The leaking roof cost them in spoiled grain. I had the roof mended within a month of my father's funeral. It was, I confess, rather more satisfying than any of the grander repairs I made to the estate that year." "Why did your father let it go?" "Because he did not think of the Hollises as people whose roof mattered," Rothmere said, with the particular flatness he reserved for the harder truths about his own family. "He thought of them as a line in a ledger, an expense to be minimized where possible. I spent a great deal of my early years believing that was simply how estates were managed, until I inherited the whole of it and discovered how much resentment my father's economies had quietly accumulated among people who had no power to object, only to endure. I have tried since to manage differently. I do not always succeed, but I try." Old Mr. Hollis, greeting them both with the particular warmth reserved for a landlord who had earned genuine respect rather than merely commanded formal deference, insisted upon showing Honora the mended roof personally, and his wife pressed upon her a basket of fresh eggs and a jar of preserves with such evident pleasure at the gesture that Honora found herself unexpectedly moved by the whole small exchange, by the plain, unglamorous evidence of etiquette it ruined him in society's eyes, since no one in London would ever trouble to learn of a mended roof on a tenant farm, but because he had decided, but Dad, it would read if that. "You are a good man," she said, as they drove back toward the great house in the fading afternoon light, the basket of eggs balanced carefully between them. "I'm a man trying to correct my father's mistakes one roof at a time," Rothmere said, "which is a considerably less flattering description, though I confess I prefer yours." He glanced at her sideways, something almost shy in the expression, an emotion she had rarely seen cross his guarded face. "I wanted you to see this part of it, not the ballrooms, not the London house with its chandeliers and its performance of wealth. This. The actual weight of the thing I am asking you to help me carry." "I am not frightened of weight, Lord Rothmere," Honora said. "I've carried a fair amount of it myself, these past 6 years, with rather less grand a house to show for the effort. I find I do not mind the prospect of carrying it alongside someone, for once rather than entirely alone." That evening, a summer storm broke suddenly over Ashworth Park, driving the assembled guests indoors well before the planned outdoor entertainment could properly begin, and Honora found herself, an hour later, standing at the tall windows of the estate's long gallery, watching lightning flicker silver over the darkened lake while the rest of the party retreated to cards and idle conversation in the drawing room below. Rothmere found her there, as she had somehow known he would. "You do not care for storms," he observed, coming to stand beside her at the window, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers. "I find them honest," Honora said. "There is no pretense in a storm. It does not perform gentleness, it does not feel, the way so much of London does. It simply is what it is, entirely without apology, and I find that considerably more restful than an evening of careful drawing-room conversation, whatever that admission says about my temperament." "It says," Rothmere said, "that you and I are considerably better suited than either of us had any right to expect, given how thoroughly London had convinced us both, before we met, that we were unsuited to anyone at all." He reached over, hesitantly, and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in the flickering half-light. "I used to stand at this exact window as a boy, during storms, and imagine my father was actually the sort of man who would come find me here, rather than remaining wherever he actually was, entirely elsewhere. He never did. I promised myself, somewhere in those years, that if I ever had children of my own, I would not be a man who left a child standing alone at a window during a storm." "You will not be," Honora said, with quiet certainty. "I have watched you with old Mr. Hollis, and with your mother, and with a stubborn spinster who refused to be flattered into agreeing with anything you said. You are not your father, Gabriel. You have spent 11 years proving that, in 100 small ways, no one in London ever thought to notice, and I have noticed every one of them. It was the first time she had used his given name, and he turned to her at the Pemerits. He tardened she would remember, she thought, for the whole of her life afterward. Something unguarded and vulnerable and entirely without the careful control he wore before the rest of the world. And he kissed her then, gently, in the flickering stormlight of the long gallery, with none of the ballroom's watching eyes to witness it. And Honora understood, with a certainty that settled deep and warm beneath her ribs, that whatever else London might say of them in the weeks and years to come, this private, unwitnessed add of them, in the weeks at them, this Beth, that sure run. The remaining days of the country party passed in the particular golden haze of a happiness Honora had never before allowed herself to fully trust. And it was on the second-to-last evening, walking with Prudence along the same lakeshore where they had first spoken of Julian Faircroft's unexpected substance, that Honora learned her friend's own quiet happiness had at last found its proper shape. "He asked me this morning," Prudence said, unable to entirely contain the smile that kept breaking through her attempted composure, "while we were meant to be discussing nothing more consequential than the merits of a particular sonnet. He simply stopped in the middle of a sentence about Wordsworth, and asked whether I thought I might ever consider marrying a man with no fortune to speak of, and a decided talent for making himself agreeable at other people's expense. I told him I thought I might consider it very seriously indeed, provided he stopped hiding quite so much of his actual intelligence behind the foppishness, since I found the foppishness considerably less interesting than the man beneath it." Prudence. Honora seized her friend's hands, genuinely delighted. "I could not be happier for you. Truly." "I confess I did not expect it," Prudence said, more quietly now, some of the old caution returning to her voice. "I had made my peace, you know, with the shade my life seemed destined to take. My mother's illness took the years other women spent finding husbands, and I told myself, quite firmly, that I did not mind the loss, that I had found other satisfactions to fill the space where a marriage might otherwise have gone. I am not entirely certain I believed myself, in the telling, but I told myself regardless, because the alternative was simply too painful to sit with honestly. And now, Prudence said, I find I am rather glad I did not entirely succeed in convincing myself. Watching you these past weeks, Honora, watching you refuse to shrink yourself smaller to fit a world that had already decided what shape you ought to occupy, I think it gave me permission to want something again, without immediately assuming the wanting was foolish. You did that. I do not think you fully understand how much you did that, simply by refusing, all those years, to stop being entirely yourself. It was the Dowager Marchioness, on the final evening of the party, who drew Honora aside once more into a quiet corner. This time not an alcove off a crowded ballroom, but a small, book-lined study where a fire burned low against the evening chill, and told her, for the first time, the fuller history behind her curious habit of testing London's women in a seamstress's borrowed clothes. I did not begin this practice out of mere eccentric amusement, whatever London believes, the Marchioness said, settling into a worn leather chair with the particular ease of a woman entirely at home in her own house. I began it because I was, myself, once tested in precisely this manner, and found the world considerably wanting in the answer it gave. My own mother, you understand, was a lady's companion before she married my father, a woman of genuine gentility, but no fortune whatsoever, taken on as companion to a wealthy relation and treated, for the better part of a decade, as scarcely more than furniture that occasionally spoke. My father, then merely the second son of a modest family with no expectation of inheriting anything grand, fell in love with her, not despite her circumstances but almost, I think, because of the particular grace with which she bore them, because she never once, in all those years of being overlooked, allowed the overlooking to make her small, or bitter, or cruel to those beneath her in turn. I did not know that, Honora said, genuinely moved. Very few do. It is not the sort of history a family advertises, once fortune and title have arrived to smooth over its rougher edges. The Marchioness's dry humor softened, for a moment, into something more tender. My mother taught me, before she died, that the truest measure of a person's character is not how they behave before those who might reward them for good behavior, but how they behave before those who have nothing whatsoever to offer them in return. I have spent my whole life since testing exactly that principle, in whatever disguise proved convenient, because I found no other method half so reliable for separating genuine character from performance. You passed the test, Miss Vane, more thoroughly than any woman I have examined in 30 years of examining them. I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it only because you are about to marry my son. I say it because it happens to be entirely true." Honora, moved beyond easy words by the confidence, could only press the old woman's hand in silent gratitude, and the Marchioness, understanding the gesture for what it was, patted her hand in return with the brisk, satisfied affection of a woman who had, after 30 years of careful searching, finally found precisely what she had been looking for. Edmund Vane, for his part, arrived at Ashworth Park only for the final 2 days of the party, having remained in London to settle what he described, with unusual gravity, as certain matters. And Honora discovered upon his arrival that her brother had undergone a quiet transformation in the weeks since Rothmere's blunt warning in the Vane drawing-room. "I have ridden to Thorn myself," Edmund told her on the last evening, finding her alone on the terrace after dinner, his customary bluster entirely absent from his voice. "Settled the whole remainder of the debt from my own income, without troubling Rothmere's solicitor to manage it, though I understand he had already offered. I did not want to begin this new chapter of the family's fortunes leaning on my sister's marriage to solve problems that were, properly speaking, mine to solve. I have been a poor steward of what father left me, Honora. I know it. I have known it for years and found it easier to manage the knowing by pressing you toward whatever advantage presented itself, rather than doing the harder work of managing the estate properly myself. I am trying to do better. I do not ask you to forgive the whole of it at once. I ask only that you allow me the chance to prove the trying is genuine." Honora, who had spent so many years bracing herself against her brother's calculations, found she had no ready reply for this unexpected honesty, and settled instead for taking his hand and holding it a moment in silence. A gesture that said, more plainly than any words could have managed, that the chance he asked for had already, quietly, been granted. The party returned to London a fortnight before the wedding, and Honora found herself, on a bright morning some days later, standing once more before Madame Yvette's counter on Bond Street. This time, not for a length of mourning wool, but for the final fitting of her wedding gown, commissioned weeks before and now nearly complete. A simple ivory silk that owed nothing to the ostentatious excess Cordelia Pemberton might once have chosen, and everything to Honora's own quiet, considered taste. Madame Yvette herself, kneeling now at Honora's hem with pins held carefully between her lips, paused in her work to look up with an expression of genuine, unguarded warmth. "I confess, Miss Vane," she said, "around the pins, I did not expect, on the day of that unpleasantness with Miss Pemberton, that I would find myself dressing you for a marquess's wedding within the 12-month. I am ashamed to say I did nothing that day but hope the trouble would pass without costing me custom either way. I have thought of it often since, and I am sorry for the cowardice of it. You needn't apologize to me, Madame Yvette," Honora said gently. "You had a livelihood to protect, and precious little power to protect it with, against a family like the Pembertons. I understood the calculation, even at the time, whatever I thought of it. Perhaps," Madame Yvette said, returning to her pinning, "but I have watched, since, what came of your refusing to make the same calculation, and I find I admire it rather more than I have admired anything in a long while. There are not many in the city willing to risk something for someone who cannot repay the risk in kind. I shall remember it the next time some careless girl knocks an old woman to my floor. I do not intend to look away again." It was, Honora thought, watching the old woman work with renewed and evident conviction, perhaps the truest measure of everything the past months had accomplished. Not merely her own happiness, considerable as it was, but the small, rippling changes it had set in motion in people who had never expected to be changed by the example of a spinster's stubborn refusal to look away from cruelty. The last significant piece of unfinished business concluded itself without any direct effort on Honora's part. Lady Vermont, whose social ambitions had never fully recovered from Rothmere's blunt warning in her own drawing-room, announced within the month her intention to remove to Bath for an extended period, citing her health, though London's more perceptive gossips understood the removal for precisely what it was, a strategic retreat from a battlefield she had decisively lost, undertaken before the whispers of her own manufactured scandal could circle back, as such whispers eventually do, to damage the reputation of the woman who had first set them loose. Honora heard of the departure with no particular satisfaction and no particular regret. Only a quiet sense that the matter had, at last, properly and permanently closed itself, in the manner such things generally do once the truth has been given sufficient room to outrun the lie. Cordelia Pemberton, meanwhile, had begun, quietly, and with none of her former performance of gracious good humor, to call upon Prudence Holloway on occasion, the two young women having discovered, in the aftermath of Cordelia's public reckoning at Ashworth Park, an unexpected common ground in their shared appetite for genuine, rather than performed, conversation. Mrs. Pemberton, by all accounts, disapproved thoroughly of the acquaintance, considering Prudence far too unfashionable and unconnected to be worth her daughter's time. Cordelia, for what Honora understood to be the first occasion in her young life, had simply continued the friendship regardless, a small act of quiet independence that Honora, hearing of it second-hand, found herself hoping might prove the first of many. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and mild, the kind of soft, early autumn light that seemed, Honora thought, watching it spill through her bedroom window, entirely too gentle for the enormity of what the day was about to contain. She had chosen, against Charlotte's strenuous objections, to be married not in one of London's grand fashionable chapels but in the small stone church near Ashworth Park, where generations of Rothmeres had been christened, married, and buried, a modest building of weathered grey stone that held, at most, perhaps 60 souls comfortably. And Honora had never once, in all the weeks of planning, regretted the choice. "You are certain," Charlotte had asked, more than once, in the days leading up to the wedding, "that you would not prefer something grander? St. George's, perhaps, where all the fashionable weddings—" "I am entirely certain," Honora had said, each time, with a patience she found came more easily now than it once had, softened by happiness into something closer to genuine amusement at her sister-in-law's persistent inability to imagine a woman choosing smallness, deliberately, rather than settling for it. "I have spent my whole life on the edges of grand things, Charlotte, admiring them from a careful distance, because I was never quite fashionable enough to stand properly inside them. I find I have no wish to be married inside one now, merely because I finally could be. I would rather be married somewhere that feels like mine." Prudence arrived early that morning to help her dress, along with the Dowager Marchioness, who had appointed herself, with characteristic bluntness, to the office of overseeing the whole proceeding with the same brisk efficiency she brought to every other undertaking. "Stand still," the Marchioness instructed, adjusting the fall of Honora's ivory silk with the critical eye of a woman who had, by her own admission, waited 30 years to dress a daughter-in-law she genuinely approved of. "You are fidgeting like a girl half your age, Honora, and I will not have my son's bride arrive at the altar with her hem crooked, because she could not stand still for 5 minutes together." "I am not fidgeting from vanity, my lady," Honora said, though she obeyed, holding herself as still as her nerves allowed. "I confess I am rather more anxious than I expected to be, given how certain I have felt of the choice itself these past months." "That is not anxiety about the choice," the Marchioness said, not unkindly, securing a final pin. "That is simply the ordinary trembling of standing at the edge of a life you have wanted badly enough to be frightened of losing it. I felt precisely the same the morning I married Gabriel's father, and I had known him a great deal less certainly than you have come to know my son. It passes the moment you see his face at the altar. I promise you that much from experience." Prudence, arranging a small circlet of late roses, cut, at Honora's particular request, from her own mother's neglected garden rather than from any grander hothouse arrangement, into Honora's dark hair, caught her friend's eye in the looking-glass and smiled. "Your mother would be very proud," Prudence said quietly, understanding without being told precisely why the roses mattered. "I remember her, you know, from when we were girls. She never once cared what London thought of her garden, planning whatever she pleased regardless of fashion. I think she would find it fitting that you carried a piece of it with you today." Honora, blinking back unexpected tears that threatened the whole careful arrangement of her face, could only nod too, moved for words, and Prudence, understanding, said nothing further, only finished her work with gentle, careful hands. Some considerable distance away, in the modest rooms Rothmere had taken at the local inn, rather than sleep the final night before his wedding beneath his own roof, a small superstition his mother had insisted upon over his own considerable skepticism, Gabriel found himself facing a rather different variety of the same trembling anticipation. "You look as though you are preparing to face a firing squad rather than a wedding," Julian Faircroft observed, adjusting his own cravat in the small looking-glass while Rothmere stood, uncharacteristically still, at the window, watching the morning light gather over the church spire visible above the trees. "I have faced a great many difficult things in my life," Rothmere said. "Debts, lawsuits, my father's funeral. I do not believe any of them prepared me adequately for this particular species of terror." "That," Faircroft said, "is generally considered a promising sign, my lord, whatever it feels like from the inside. I am told the men who feel nothing on their wedding morning are generally the ones who come, in time, to regret the marriage most bitterly. Terror, in my admittedly limited experience of observing such things, tends to indicate the stakes are genuinely felt rather than merely performed." "You speak with unusual confidence for a man not yet married himself." "I speak," Faircroft said, with a small, private smile, "as a man who intends to be married himself before the year is out and finds he has already begun experiencing a milder version of precisely the same terror in anticipation. I take it as encouraging evidence that Miss Halloway and I are embarking on something rather more substantial than either of us initially expected when we first found ourselves thrown together at your mother's country party." Rothmere turned from the window at that, genuine warmth breaking through his own nervous distraction. "Faircroft, that is excellent news. I confess I had rather hoped, watching the two of you these past weeks, that something might come of it. As had I, though I did not dare hope quite so openly until she gave me reason to." Faircroft's expression sobered slightly, turning more serious than his usual manner generally permitted. "I will say this, Rothmere, and then I shall let the matter rest, since I know you have rather more pressing business to attend to this morning than my own sentimental observations. I have known you some years now, chiefly as an acquaintance rather than an intimate friend, and I have watched you, in that time, grow steadily colder and more guarded with every season that passed, until I confess I had begun to wonder whether anything remained beneath the guarding worth the effort of reaching. Miss Vane has undone 11 years of that guarding in the space of a few months, and I do not believe I have ever seen a transformation I found more heartening to witness. Whatever terror you were feeling this morning, I would ask you to set it beside that fact, and let the fact carry rather more weight in the balance." Rothmere said nothing for a long moment, moved beyond his usual composure by the unexpected sincerity of the observation, and then extended his hand, which Faircroft clasped firmly. "Thank you," Rothmere said simply. "I believe I needed to hear that this morning rather more than I realized before you said it." The bells of the small stone church began to ring the hour shortly after, and Gabriel, Marquess of Rothmere, straightened his cravat one final time and went to be married. The church was full to its modest capacity by the time Honora arrived. 60 faces turned toward the door in the hushed, expectant silence particular to weddings. And she saw, in the first sweeping glance she allowed herself before her eyes found the one face she was truly searching for. The whole assembled evidence of a life that had, against every expectation London had ever pressed upon her, arranged itself into something worth celebrating. Edmund stood near the front, Charlotte beside him with an expression that had, for once, softened into something Honora recognized as genuine emotion rather than calculation. Prudence stood as her attendant, radiant in pale blue, catching Honora's eye with a smile that held 6 years of shared confidences behind it. Old Mr. Hollis and his wife had been given a place near the back, at Gabriel's particular insistence, alongside a dozen other tenant families who had known the Rothmere name their whole lives and had never once, until this Marquess, been made to feel their presence at such an occasion was welcome rather than merely tolerated. Julian Faircroft stood beside Gabriel at the altar rail in the office of groomsman, and the Dowager Marchioness occupied the front pew in a gown of deep gray silk that Honora recognized with a private catch of emotion as cut in nearly the same unassuming style as the seamstress's dress she had worn on the floor of Madame Yvette's shop all those months before. A private joke shared between the two women that required no explanation to anyone else present, though the Marchioness caught Honora's eye across the church and offered, in acknowledgement, the smallest and most satisfies. And there at the altar itself stood Gabriel, tall and severe and, for once, entirely without the guarded composure he wore before the rest of the world, watching her walk toward him down the short stone aisle with an expression so openly, unashamedly tender that Honora felt the whole church, the whole weight of London's opinion, the whole accumulated arithmetic of 6 years spent being told her worth, had already been calculated and found wanting. Simply fall away, leaving nothing behind uncomplicated fact of two people who had found, against every reasonable expectation, exactly what they need. The vicar, an elderly man named Mr. Aldridge, who had christened Gabriel himself some 33 years before, spoke the familiar words of the service in a voice roughened by age, but steady with long practice, and Honora, standing beside Gabriel with her hand in his, found she heard every word with a clarity she had not expected. The old, well-worn promises of the marriage service settling into her, not as genuine intention, freshly mint. When the moment came for their own words, spoken plainly and without the formal grandeur either of them might once have expected such a moment to require, Gabriel's voice, usually so carefully controlled, caught slightly as he spoke. I have spent 11 years believing that anyone who claimed to want me wanted, in truth, only what I possessed, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. You have spent these past months teaching me, patiently and without once demanding I learn the lesson faster than I was able, that wanting and possessing are not the same thing at all, and that the rarest gift one person can offer another is simply the plain, unremarkable truth of themselves, offered without calculation and without condition. I promise you, Honora, that I will spend whatever years I am given trying to be worthy of having been chosen by a woman who chose me for nothing more than what I actually am. Honora, her own voice steadier than she had expected, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears, answered in kind. I spent 6 years believing the world had already decided my worth, and had decided, moreover, that the sum came to very little. You looked at me on an ordinary Tuesday, in a dress shop, on the strength of nothing more than a single small kindness, and saw something worth crossing an entire ballroom for. I promise you that I will spend whatever years I am given making certain you never once regret that crossing, and that I will love you, plainly and honestly, exactly as you are, for exactly as long as we both shall live. When Mr. Aldridge pronounced them man and wife, the small church erupted into an applause considerably less restrained than propriety generally permitted, led, Honora would learn later, with considerable amusement, by old Mr. Hollis himself, who declared afterward that he had not clapped so heartily at anything since his own wedding 50 years before, and saw no particular reason to restrain the impulse merely because the setting happened to be a church rather than a harvest festival. The wedding breakfast that followed was held not in any grand hired hall, but in a great striped marquee erected upon Ashworth Park's south lawn, close enough to the lake that the afternoon light danced silver across the water beyond the open sides of the tent, and close enough to the tenant farms that several of the estate's own families invited alongside London's fashionable guests in a mingling of company that would, Honora suspected, be talked of in certain drawing rooms for weeks as a curious breach of custom, sat comfortably among marquesses and modestas' daughters alike, sharing the same tables, daughters alike, sharing the tates not so. Sad might have been Rainai. It was Julian Faircroft who rose first to offer a toast, tapping his glass with a fork until the assembled company quieted, his customary theatrical flourish tempered, for once, by something genuinely sincere beneath it. I've known Gabriel Rothmere some years now, he began, chiefly as a man who attended precisely as many social functions as duty absolutely required, and not one occasion more, and who regarded the whole institution of courtship, so far as I could ever determine, with roughly the enthusiasm most men reserve for a visit to the dentist. I confess I had begun to despair of ever seeing him married at all, short of some direct intervention by his mother, whom I understand has orchestrated rather more of this happy outcome than modesty generally permits her to admit. A ripple of laughter, and the marchioness, seated near the head table, inclined her head with unrepentant satisfaction. But I have watched, these past months, a transformation in my friend that I did not believe possible, and I have come to understand that it required nothing more complicated than a woman honest enough to refuse every performance he had spent 11 years expecting from everyone around him. To Gabriel and Honora, may you both spend the whole of your lives exactly as unimpressed by pretense as you were on the day you first met on a rainy pavement over a parcel of sewing needles. The toast was met with warm applause, and it was the Dowager Marchioness herself who rose next, silencing the assembled company with nothing more than the simple fact of standing, a lifetime's authority requiring no further enforcement. I have very little to add to what has already been said so eloquently, she began, except this. I have spent 30 years testing the women of London's ton, in one disguise or another, searching for precisely the quality my own mother taught me to value above every other consideration a marriage might offer. Genuine character, demonstrated not before an audience of people who might reward it, but before those who had nothing whatsoever to offer in return. I tested a great many women in these 30 years and found, more often than I care to admit, disappointment. I did not expect, on an ordinary Tuesday on Bond Street, wearing a dress darned at both elbows, to find at last precisely what I had spent 3 decades searching for. I am an old woman, and I do not often admit to being wrong about anything, having found the practice generally unnecessary. But I confess I was wrong to believe my son incapable of recognizing genuine worth when he encountered it. He recognized it before I did. In truth, on that same afternoon, standing on the pavement in his own ordinary coat, and I have never in my life been more grateful to be proven mistaken about anything. She raised her glass, her voice thick with an emotion she made no effort to disguise. To my son, and to the daughter I have wanted for 30 years and very nearly given up hope of ever finding. There was scarcely a dry eye in the marquis by the time she resumed her seat, and Honora, overcome, could only rise and embrace the old woman properly, to the evident delight of the assembled company, before the orchestra, smaller and considerably less grand than the one that had played at the London ball, but no less joyful for the difference, struck up the first notes of the wedding's opening dance. Gabriel led her out onto the makeshift floor, laid across the lawn, and as they turned together beneath the golden afternoon light, considerably less formal, and considerably more genuinely joyful than the careful waltz they had shared months before beneath London chandeliers, Honora found herself laughing, an easy, unguarded sound that surprised even herself with its lightness. "What amuses you?" Gabriel asked, drawing her closer as the dance turned them past the lake's glittering edge. "I am simply remembering," Honora said, "that the last time we danced together in front of an audience, I spent the entire set half convinced the whole thing would come to nothing, that some disaster would surely intervene before either of us dared trust it was real. I find I have stopped waiting for the disaster." "Good," Gabriel said and kissed her, there on the lawn in front of the whole assembled company, a gesture so entirely unlike the careful, guarded man London had known for 11 years that it drew a fresh round of delighted applause from the watching guests. "I have grown rather tired of disasters myself. I find I much prefer this." It had not all been effortless harmony in the months leading to that wedding day, and Honora would not have wished it to be. She had learned, early in her acquaintance with Gabriel, that the easiest kind of love, the kind built entirely on agreement, on two people discovering they wanted precisely the same things in precisely the same order, was rarely the kind that lasted. And she had found herself, on more than one occasion during their courtship, testing the sturdier variety instead. The disagreement that Honora would remember most clearly, in later years, had arisen some 6 weeks before the wedding, over a matter that seemed, on its surface, almost too small to warrant the intensity with which they had both approached it. The question of what should be done with a parcel of common land at the edge of the Ashworth estate, long used by the tenant families for grazing a small number of shared livestock, which Gabriel's steward had proposed enclosing and letting to a single wealthy farmer for considerably greater rent. "It is simply good business," Gabriel had said, over dinner at Rothmere House, laying out the steward's figures with the brisk efficiency he brought to every estate matter. "The enclosure would nearly double the income from that particular parcel, and I have debts still outstanding for my father's mismanagement that such income would help considerably to settle." "And what becomes of the families who currently graze their animals there?" Honora had asked, setting down her own fork, something sharpening in her voice that she did not trouble to soften. "The Hollis family, among others, if I recall the parcel's boundaries correctly from our visit. They would be compensated. My steward assures me the arrangement is standard practice across half the estates in the county." "Standard practice is not the same thing as right practice, Gabriel," Honora had said, "and I confess I am surprised to hear you invoke it as though the two were interchangeable, given everything you have told me about your father's own economies and how thoroughly you resented inheriting the resentment they caused. You mended Hollis Farm's roof because it was the right thing to do, not because your steward's figures recommended it. I do not understand why this parcel of land should be judged by a different standard merely because the sum involved is larger." The disagreement had continued, sharper on both sides than either of them entirely expected, through the remainder of that dinner and into a second conversation 2 days later, Gabriel arguing the practical necessity of settling his father's debts, Honora arguing that debts settled at the expense of tenant families who had no power to object constituted precisely the kind of transaction she had spent her whole life despising in London's ballrooms, merely relocated to a ledger instead. It was not, in the end, Honora's argument alone that resolved the matter, nor Gabriel's capitulation to it out of mere affection, but something closer to genuine collaboration. Gabriel returning, some days later, with an alternative arrangement his steward had initially dismissed as impractical, a reduced enclosure that preserved sufficient common grazing for the tenant families while still letting a smaller adjacent parcel at improved rent, achieving perhaps 2/3 of the original proposed income without declassing anyone who currently depended upon the land. It is not so tidy a solution as the original figure suggested, Gabriel admitted, laying the revised proposal before her. It will take longer to settle the remaining debts, but I found, turning your argument over these past days, that I did not much like the man I would have had to become in order to sign the original arrangement without a second thought, and I discovered I would rather be somewhat poorer, somewhat longer, than become that particular man in order to avoid it. I did not ask you to become poorer, Honora said. I asked you to be honest with yourself about what standard practice was costing people who had no voice in setting it. I know, Gabriel said. That is precisely what I meant. I do not believe I would have found this alternative at all had you not been honest enough to argue with me about it, rather than simply trusting my figures because I presented them with sufficient confidence. I begin to suspect this is rather the whole point of what I asked of you. That evening by the river, an equal partner rather than a wife who agrees. I did not fully understand until this particular disagreement quite how much work equal partnership would actually require of both of us. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I do not mind the work in the slightest. It was a small victory in the grand accounting of their courtship. A parcel of common land, a handful of tenant families whose names London would never trouble to learn, but Honora understood, turning it over afterward, that it mattered rather more than many of the grander gestures that had preceded it, because it proved something the ballroom dances and the garden confessions, however genuine, had not yet fully tested, that when Gabriel Rothmere's comfortable assumptions and Honora Vane's uncomfortable honesty collided directly against one another, or a matter of real consequence when they hearted, the two of them mere, that it too another decided. It was, she thought, watching him fold the revised proposal away with quiet satisfaction, precisely the kind of marriage she had once believed impossible to find in London's transactional arithmetic. Not two people agreeing to want the same things, but two people willing to argue honestly about what mattered and trusting the argument itself as evidence of respect rather than threat to it. A year passed, as years do, faster in the recollection than they ever felt in the living of them, and Honora Vane, Honora, Marquess of Rothmere, a title she still occasionally found strange to answer to, after 26 years of being overlooked by every rank London had to offer, found herself, on a mild autumn morning much like the one that had begun this whole improbable story, standing once more in the small garden behind Ashworth Park, watching her mother's transplanted roses take root in soil considerably kinder than the modest London plot they had originally occupied. Much had changed in the year since the wedding, and much, she was glad to find, had not. Prudence had married Julian Faircroft in the spring in a ceremony every bit as unfashionable and every bit as genuinely joyful as Honora's own had been, and the two of them had taken a modest house not far from Ashworth Park, close enough that the friendship forged over borrowed novels and shared confidences continued uninterrupted, merely relocated to grander gardens and considerably more frequent visiting. Prudence, radiant in a way Honora had never seen in all their years of friendship, had confided only the previous week that she expected, come the following spring, to add a nursery to that modest household, and Honora had wept with an unguarded happiness that surprised them both. Edmund had, against Honora's earlier expectations, held true to his promise. He had settled the whole of the family's remaining debts within 8 months, through a combination of genuine economy and the first properly attentive estate management the Vane family holdings had seen in a decade, and had written to Honora only the previous month to report, with evident and entirely unfamiliar pride, that Charlotte had recently declared herself, for the first time since their marriage, genuinely content with her husband's prospects rather than merely tolerant of his failings. Cordelia Pemberton, whose friendship with Prudence had deepened steadily over the intervening year, had recently announced her own engagement, Not to any titled fortune hunter her mother might once have engineered for her, but to a quiet, sensible young clergyman she had met, of all places, at one of Pruden's own modest gatherings, a match Mrs. Pemberton had initially opposed with considerable vigor before ultimately, and with visible reluctance, conceding that her daughter's happiness appeared genuine enough to outweigh her own disappointed ambitions. The Dowager Marchioness had not abandoned her habit of testing London's women in a seamstress's disguise, though she had confided to Honora, with evident satisfaction, that she had found her search rather less urgent now that her son's own marriage had turned out so entirely to her liking, and pursued the practice these days more for the sport of it than from any remaining necessity. Gabriel found Honora in the garden that autumn morning, as he so often did, drawn by some instinct that had grown, over the year of their marriage, into something approaching certainty about exactly where he would find her. "You are thinking of your mother," he said, coming to stand beside her among the transplanted roses. No question in the observation, only quiet recognition. "I am thinking that she would have liked you," Honora said. "Not for the title or the fortune, though I suppose those would not have troubled her either. She would have liked you because you mended a roof no one asked you to mend, and because you argued with me properly over a parcel of common land rather than simply indulging me to keep the peace, and because you have never once, in the whole of this past year, asked me to be smaller than I actually am." Gabriel drew her close, and together they stood a while longer among the roses, watching the morning light gather over Ashworth Park's rolling parkland, and Honora thought, not for the first time, that the whole of London's careful arithmetic, the ledgers of dowry and connection and fashionable beauty by which the ton had once calculated her worth and found it wanting, had never once accounted for the particular, quiet wealth of a life built honestly, on ground tested and found sound, between two people who had each, in their own way, refused to let a gruel and Transellensen this saf. Before the wedding, in the weeks between the country party and the return to London for the final preparations, there had been one further test of Honora's resolve that she would remember, in later years, as among the more instructive of the whole long courtship, an evening at the theater that very nearly undid, in a single careless hour, all the hard-won trust the preceding months had built between herself and Gabriel. It had been Gabriel's suggestion, offered with the particular hesitance of a man attempting a gesture he was not entirely confident would be well received, a private box at the Theatre Royal, taken for a performance of a new comedy much discussed that season, an outing that would mark, in effect, their first fully public appearance together as an engaged couple since the announcement, and would therefore be scrutinized by every fashionable eye in London with an intensity that made Honora's stomach tighten at the mere prospect. "You needn't come, if the attention troubles you," Gabriel had said when she confessed as much to him over tea 2 days prior. "I would as soon spend the evening quietly at home. If you would prefer it. I would prefer, rather, to stop allowing London's attention to dictate what I do and do not attempt," Honora had said, with more conviction than she entirely felt. "I have spent 6 years shrinking from exactly this sort of scrutiny, and I find I am tired of the shrinking. Let us go, and let them look, and let them find whatever satisfaction they can in the looking." The evening began well enough. The box Gabriel had taken afforded an excellent view of both stage and audience, and Honora found the comedy itself, a broad, cheerfully absurd piece concerning a case of mistaken identity among a family of minor gentry, genuinely entertaining, enough that she laughed aloud on several occasions with a freedom she rarely permitted herself in public, drawing, she was uncomfortably aware, a certain number of curious glances from the boxes opposite, where London's fashionable set had gathered in equal parts to watch the performance and to watch each other. It was during the interval, when Gabriel had gone briefly to fetch refreshment and Honora remained alone in the box, that the evening's difficulty presented itself, in the person of a woman Honora did not immediately recognize. Elegant, perhaps 40, with the particular polished assurance of a woman who had spent decades comfortably established at the very center of fashionable society, and who entered the box uninvited with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to going wherever she pleased. "Miss Vane," the woman said, seating herself without waiting to be asked, her smile pleasant enough on its surface to make the underlying edge, when it came, land all the more sharply for the contrast. "Or shall I say, very soon now, Lady Rothmere. I confess I have been curious to make your acquaintance properly, having heard so very much about you this past season. I am Lady Caroline Ashe. I knew Gabriel's father a little in his time, and I flatter myself that I knew Gabriel himself rather well, some years back, before his father's death changed the shape of his prospects so considerably. There was something in the phrasing, before his father's death changed the shape of his prospects, that Honora recognized, even before Lady Ashe continued, as a deliberate needle, calculated to plant precisely the seed of doubt it went on, over the following several minutes, to cultivate with practiced skill. I do hope you understand what you are undertaking, my dear. Lady Ashe continued, her voice pitched low and confiding, the tone of a woman offering unwelcome wisdom purely out of concern for its recipient. Gabriel is not, whatever this present courtship might suggest, an easy man to hold. I knew him before the guarding set in fully, before his father's debts, before the 11 years of fortune hunters taught him to trust no one. He was warmer, once, and considerably more inclined to affection, before circumstance made him wary of it. I confess I wonder sometimes whether the man you believe you have won is entirely the man who exists beneath the performance he has learned, since, to offer the world, I wonder whether you have simply caught him at a moment of weakness, and whether the guarding will not, in time, reassert itself, once the novelty of your particular honesty has worn thin against the ordinary demands of a long marriage. Honora, caught entirely off guard by the calculated cruelty of the observation, cruelty dressed, as Lady Vermont's had been, in the careful clothing of concerned candor, felt something cold settle in her chest, the old familiar doubt she had thought largely conquered rising unbidden at the suggestion that Gabriel's affection might prove, in the end, no more durable than a passing weakness. She might, in an earlier version of herself, have allowed the doubt to fester unspoken, carrying it home to turn over alone in the small hours, rather than risk the vulnerability of voicing it directly. She had learned better these past months and found, to her own credit, that the lesson held even under the pressure of the moment. I appreciate your candor, Lady Ashe, she said when she had recovered sufficient composure, though I confess I find myself wondering what purpose it serves, beyond troubling a woman on the eve of her wedding with doubts she has not herself raised. I do not know the man you described from years I did not share with him. I know the man who mended a tenant's roof because it was right, and who apologized to me on his knees in wet grass rather than simply assume his own doubt need not be answered honestly, and who has argued with me, properly and respectfully, over matters of real consequence rather than merely charming me into agreement. If some part of that man remains capable of the coldness you describe, I expect I shall discover it in time, as every marriage eventually discovers the fuller truth of both parties involved. I do not intend to spend the intervening years anticipating disappointment on the strength of a stranger's second-hand recollection of a man I have come to know rather more directly than you seem to credit. Lady Ashe's smile tightened fractionally, evidently unaccustomed to having her carefully deployed doubt met with anything other than the visible alarm she had presumably intended to provoke, and she rose, with the brittle grace of a woman abandoning a strategy that had failed to land as planned, murmuring some final pleasantry about looking forward to the wedding before withdrawing from the box entirely. Honora told Gabriel of the exchange that same evening, in the carriage home, refusing to allow even this small unpleasantness to fester unspoken between them, and watched his jaw tighten with familiar, guarded anger as she recounted it. "Caroline Ashe," he said when she had finished. I had nearly forgotten her existence, which I suppose says rather more about the nature of whatever passed between us some years back than any account I could offer you directly. It was brief and it ended badly, chiefly because I discovered, rather too late, that her interest in me had considerably more to do with my prospects than with my company. I am sorry she troubled you with it. I am sorrier still that some part of what she said found purchase enough to trouble you at all. It did trouble me, Honora admitted, for a moment, but I find, examining the trouble honestly, that it was never truly doubt of you, Gabriel. It was the old habit of doubting my own judgment, resurfacing under pressure, and I begin to think that habit may take rather longer to fully unlearn than the trust I have built in you these past months. I do not say that to burden you with managing my doubts on my behalf. I say it because I promised you honesty, and I find I would rather offer you the whole of it, difficult parts included, than perform a confidence I have not yet fully earned for myself. I would not want it any other way, Gabriel said, drawing her hand into his own across the carriage seat. I have had quite enough performed confidence to last several lifetimes, from a great many people considerably less honest than you have ever once been with me. I will take your honest doubt, Honora, over anyone else's practiced certainty every single time you offer it. There remained one further thread of the story that Honora would not learn in full until some weeks after the wedding, pieced together gradually from Edmund's own increasingly candid letters and a single conversation with William Thorne himself, who called upon Ashworth Park unexpectedly one autumn afternoon to deliver, in person, the final settled papers regarding the old debt between their two families. I confess I did not expect to be received so warmly by a marchioness, Thorne admitted, seated rather stiffly in the estate's smaller parlor, plainly uncertain of his welcome, despite Honora's evident hospitality. I have spent a good portion of my life dealing with families considerably less gracious than yours has proven in matters of unpaid debt. My father used to say that a man's true character showed itself most clearly not in how he behaved when money was owed to him, but in how he behaved once the debt had finally been settled, whether he remembered the kindness of patience or simply forgot at the moment the ledger balance. I remember it, Honora said simply. My father trusted your father as a friend, Mr. Thorne, and I do not believe that trust was ever misplaced, whatever confusion Lady Vermont saw fit to manufacture from it. I am glad the matter is settled properly at last, and I am gladder still that it was settled honestly, rather than merely swept aside by my husband's fortune without my brother's own hard work counting for anything in the resolving of it. Your brother wrote to me himself, you know, before the wedding, Thorne said, asking whether he might call in person to apologize for the length of the delay, rather than simply settling the sum by post and considering the matter closed. I confess I found the gesture rather more moving than the money itself. Not many men in his position would have troubled themselves with the courtesy. Once a marquess's solicitor had already offered to make the whole business disappear. Honora, hearing this, felt a fresh wave of the quiet, surprised pride she had come to associate with her brother's slow transformation of the preceding year, a transformation she had not fully trusted in its earliest days, and had come, gradually and against her own long habit of guarded skepticism, to believe genuine. Gabriel, joining the conversation partway through, found himself equally struck by the exchange, and remarked upon it later that evening, as the two of them sat together before the fire in the small book-lined study that had, over the year of their marriage, become their customary place for quiet conversation at the close of each day. I did not expect, when I threatened your brother in your own drawing-room all those months ago, that the threat would produce quite so thorough a reformation, Gabriel admitted. I confess I expected, at best, a temporary caution, sufficient to prevent him troubling you directly, and assumed the underlying character would remain largely unchanged beneath it. I did not expect it either, Honora said. I had spent 6 years watching Edmund manage our family's finances with a mixture of optimism and avoidance that never once resolved into anything resembling genuine responsibility. And I confess I had rather given up hope of seeing him change, whatever fresh crisis presented itself to prompt the attempt. I think, in the end, it was not merely your threat that changed him, though I do not doubt the threat concentrated his attention usefully. I think watching the two of us, watching a marriage built on honesty rather than calculation, succeeding where every calculated match he had ever half-hoped I might make would surely have failed Ponty, gave him something to aspire toward that he had not previously believed himself capable of reaching. He did not want, I think, to remain the only person in the family still governed by the old arithmetic, once he had seen an alternative demonstrated so plainly in front of him. Gabriel was quiet for a moment, turning this over with the particular thoughtful attention he brought to every observation Honora offered him, a habit she had come, over the year of their marriage, to treasure rather more than any grander romantic gesture he might have offered instead. I find, he said finally, that I did not fully understand, when I first crossed that ballroom to ask you to dance, quite how much would come of the crossing. I thought I was simply following an instinct I did not entirely trust myself to name. Some recognition of genuine character, offered without calculation, that 11 years of guarded suspicion had nearly trained me to distrust on sight. I did not anticipate that the instinct would unmake, in the course of a single season, so much of what I had assumed permanently settled about my own life. My mother's search finally concluded, your brother's whole character quietly transformed, even poor Faircroft finding his own happiness in the ripples of it, quite by accident, at a country party I nearly did not think to host at all. You did not unmake any of it alone, Honora said, leaning her head against his shoulder as the fire burned low before them. I crossed that ballroom too, Gabriel, in my own way. The moment I chose to speak to a stranger in a dress shop rather than looking away as everyone else in the room had already decided to do. I think that is rather the whole lesson of it, in the end, that neither of us unmade anything alone. We simply refused, both of us, on an ordinary Tuesday neither of us thought would matter, to accept that looking away was the only available choice. Everything else followed from that single small refusal, in ways neither of us could possibly have predicted, and I confess I would not trade a single one of the difficulties that followed it for a life spent looking away instead. They sat together a while longer in comfortable silence, the fire settling to embers, the whole quiet weight of the year behind them and the whole unwritten weight of the years ahead settling, comfortably and without dread, into the space between them. And Honora thought, watching the last of the firelight catch the worn sapphire right upon her finger, that whatever London's careful arithmetic had once calculated her worth to be, she had found, in the end, something the calculation had never once accounted for, a life built not on what she could offer in exchange for security, but on the plain, unremarkable, entirely suffect and forged jadeite. It is worth pausing here, dear viewers, to return briefly to that first quiet aftermath in Madame Yvette's shop, for there was more that passed between Honora and the disguised marquess that morning than either woman fully disclosed to anyone else for some months afterward, and it deserves its proper place in the telling. While Madame Yvette fussed over the ruined ribbons and the two other patrons resumed their interrupted business with the particular relief of people grateful, a scene had concluded without requiring their own participation. The old woman had lingered a moment longer than strict necessity demanded, watching Honora finish her purchase of the gray morning wool with an attention that went considerably beyond simple gratitude. "You did not hesitate," the old woman observed, as Honora counted out the careful sum for her mother's cloak. "Most young women of quality hesitate, even when their conscience urges them otherwise, weighing the cost of intervention against the comfort of remaining silent. You did not appear to weigh anything at all." "I have very little left to weigh, I'm afraid," Honora said, with the dry, unguarded honesty she reserved chiefly for people she did not expect to see again, a category she had, at that point, believed the old seamstress to occupy. "I am 26 and unmarried, which London has decided renders my good opinion largely worthless in any transaction that matters. I find that a curiously freeing position to occupy when it comes to moments such as this one. I have nothing left to protect by staying silent, and so I no longer trouble myself weighing whether silence might prove more comfortable." "You say that as though it were a small thing," the old woman said, "this business of having nothing left to protect. I wonder whether you understand how rare a gift it actually is, and how many women twice your fortune would trade everything they possess to arrive at the same freedom by any less painful road." "I do not know that I would call it a gift," Honora admitted. "Most days it feels rather more like a diagnosis. But I have made my peace with it, or told myself often enough that I have, that the telling has begun to feel almost like the truth." The old woman studied her a moment longer, something working behind her weathered face that Honora at the time could not properly read, and then asked, with a directness that struck Honora even then as somewhat unusual for a shop's chance-met seamstress, "And if a gentleman of genuine consequence were to notice this freedom of yours and find it worth pursuing rather than pitying, would you trust the noticing is vain, or would 6 years of being overlooked have taught you to suspect it as some manner of cruel joke, arranged for another's entertainment at your expense?" Honora had laughed at the question then, entirely without malice, assuming it rhetorical, the idle musing of an old woman with time enough on her hands to entertain fanciful hypotheticals. "I confess I have not had occasion to test the theory and do not expect to acquire one. Gentlemen of genuine consequence do not generally trouble themselves noticing women in my position, freedom or no freedom. I have found it wisest not to build hopes upon so unlikely a foundation." The old woman had said, in a tone Honora would only fully understand the weight of weeks later, once the carriage crest and the waistcoat button and the whole improbable unfolding of events had revealed precisely who had been asking, and why. "We shall see, Miss Vane. I find foundations are rather sturdier than young women in your position generally credit them, provided the right sort of weight is finally set upon them." It was this exchange, more than the needles themselves, that the Dowager Marchioness would later confess, in the quiet study at Ashworth Park, some months after the wedding, over a private glass of sherry shared between the two women, once the rest of the household had retired, had convinced her, on that very afternoon, that she had at last found precisely what 30 years of careful searching had been seeking. "I have tested a great many women for kindness," the marquess admitted that evening. "Kindness is common enough when the cost of it is small. What I had never yet found, in 30 years of testing, was a woman who had made a genuine, considered peace with her own low estimation in the eyes of a cruel world, and had done so without allowing the peace to curdle into either bitterness or self-pity. You spoke of your circumstances that morning the way a soldier speaks of an old wound, plainly, without either flinching from it or dramatizing it for sympathy. I knew, hearing you speak so, that whatever came of the encounter, I had found the daughter I had been searching for, whether or not my son ever proved wise enough to recognize the same thing in you himself." "He proved wise enough eventually," Honora said, smiling. "Eventually," the marquess agreed, with her customary dry humor, being rather a generous description of a process that required considerably more direct intervention on my part than either of you have ever fully credited. "But I shall not begrudge you the omission. I've found, over a long life, that the people whose happiness one has quietly engineered rarely thank one properly for the engineering. And I have made my own peace with that particular injustice, much as you made yours with London's cruel arithmetic. It is, I find, simply the price of meddling well. No proper accounting of that first eventful ball would be complete, in fact, without mention of Mr. Horace Peabody, whose brief and largely unlamented courtship of Honora, some 5 years prior, had ended in a refusal so thoroughly complete that he had, by his own later admission, required the better part of 2 seasons to recover his confidence sufficiently to court anyone else at all. Mr. Peabody attended the Rothmere ball that evening, as he attended every gathering of consequence London offered. A stout, amiable, entirely unremarkable gentleman of comfortable but unspectacular fortune, whose chief occupation seemed to consist of attaching himself to whatever conversation promised the least demand upon his own limited store of wit. He had married in the intervening years a pleasant if unimaginative woman named Miss Featherstone, now Mrs. Peabody, who accompanied him to the ball in a gown selected, Honora suspected, more for its expense than its becomingness, and who greeted Honora's presence at the gathering with the particular wariness of a woman who had heard, in considerable and embellished detail, the story of her husband's 5-year-old rejection. "Miss Vane," Mr. Peabody said, encountering Honora near the refreshment table during a lull in the evening's proceedings, his tone carrying the studied neutrality of a man determined to prove he harbored no lingering resentment, whatever the truth of the matter might actually be. "I confess I did not expect to see you at so grand a gathering. I understand congratulations may soon be in order regarding a certain marquess's attentions." "They may indeed, Mr. Peabody," Honora said with a warmth she found came easily now, buoyed by the evening's earlier events. "I hope you and Mrs. Peabody are keeping well." "Tolerably well. Tolerably well. Tolerably well." He hesitated, glancing briefly toward his wife, who had drifted a few paces distant to examine the refreshment table's offerings with visible relief at the excuse to remove herself from the conversation. "I will confess, Miss Vane, that I harbored some small resentment toward you in the year or 2 following your refusal of my own suit. I did not understand, at the time, what precisely I had done to warrant so complete a dismissal, when I had believed myself, by every ordinary measure, a perfectly reasonable match for a woman in your circumstances." "You had done nothing wrong, Mr. Peabody," Honora said gently. "I refused you because I found in our brief acquaintance that we had very little to say to one another beyond the ordinary pleasantries, and I did not believe a marriage built on pleasantries alone would sustain either of us particularly well across a lifetime. It was not, I promise you, any failing on your part. It was simply an absence of the particular connection I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, to find eventually, however unlikely my prospects for finding it appeared at the time." Mr. Peabody considered this for a long moment, his amiable face working through something more thoughtful than his customary expression generally suggested him capable of. "I believe I understand that rather better now than I did at the time," he admitted. "Mrs. Peabody and I rub along tolerably well together, Miss Vane, and I do not regret the marriage. But I confess I have sometimes wondered, watching other couples, whether tolerable rubbing along was truly the height of what marriage might offer a fortunate man, or whether I simply lacked the courage 5 years ago to hold out for something nearer what you appear to have found instead. I find I do not resent you the refusal any longer. I find, rather unexpectedly, that I am glad of it, on your behalf if not entirely on my own." It was, Honora reflected, watching Mr. Peabody rejoin his wife with a small, thoughtful frown still creasing his amiable brow, a curiously moving exchange for so unremarkable a man to have offered, and she found herself hoping, in the weeks that followed, that whatever quiet reflection the evening had prompted in him might yet find its way into some small improvement in his own marriage, however modest the improvement proved. She never learned, in the end, whether it did. London's larger dramas rarely troubled themselves to report the smaller, unglamorous reckonings of men like Horace Peabody. But she liked to imagine, on the occasions she thought of the exchange at all, that some good had come of it regardless, in whatever quiet, unwitnessed way such things generally unfold between two people who have decided, after all, to keep trying. It is easy, in the telling of such stories, to leave a villain's cruelty unexplained, as though it sprang from nothing but pure and uncomplicated malice, requiring no further accounting than the fact of its existence. But Mrs. Beatrix Pemberton had not always been the brittle, status-obsessed woman who swept through Madame Yvette's shop with such careless disregard for who stood in her path, and it is worth pausing, briefly, to understand the road that had carried her there. She had been born, some 45 years before the events of this story, to a family of modest gentility not unlike the Vanes' own, a family with land enough to maintain respectability and no fortune whatsoever to spare, and she had watched, as a girl, her own mother endure precisely the sort of casual social cruelty that London reserved for families of insufficient means. The small slights and pointed omissions that accumulate, over years, into a permanent wound never quite permitted to heal. She had married Mr. Pemberton, then a merchant of considerable but new fortune, not for love, though she had come, over the years, to feel something approaching genuine affection for him, buried beneath decades of more urgent calculation, but for the plain, unglamorous security his money promised against the particular humiliation she had watched her own mother suffer for want of it. She had spent the whole of her marriage since building, brick by careful brick, the social fortress she had once lacked, and had come to believe, somewhere in the long accumulation of years, that cruelty toward those beneath her was not cruelty at all, but simple self-preservation, a necessary vigilance against ever again occupying the vulnerable position her own girlhood had taught her to fear above all things. She had raised Cordelia in the same fearful arithmetic, teaching her daughter, however unintentionally, that kindness extended to those who could not repay it in social currency constituted not virtue but weakness, a luxury only the truly secure could afford to indulge. None of this excused the cruelty Honora had witnessed on the floor of Madame Yvette's shop, nor the calculated humiliation Mrs. Pemberton had attempted to orchestrate in its aftermath. But Honora, learning some fragments of this history much later, secondhand, through Cordelia's own gradual and increasingly candid confidences, found she could not entirely despise the woman, understanding at last that Mrs. Pemberton's brittle status hunger had never been born of genuine malice, so much as of an old, unhealed fear, dressed up over decades in silk and jewels until even its own bearer had largely forgotten the frightened girl beneath the armor. "My mother does not know how to want anything except security," Cordelia confided to Honora, some months after the wedding, during one of the quiet visits that had become a regular feature of their unlikely, hard-won friendship. "She has never once in my whole life asked me what I actually wanted, only what I ought to secure. I used to believe that was simply what mothers did, until I watched your mother-in-law, the marquess, ask you, quite directly, what you wanted for yourself, and watched you answer honestly, without fear that the answer might cost you her affection. I do not think my own mother has ever once believed such honesty was safe to offer, or to receive. I am trying to learn it regardless. It is slower going than I would like, but I am trying." Honora, hearing this, found herself grateful, not for the first time, that the whole improbable chain of events set in motion by a single ordinary Tuesday had reached further than she could ever have anticipated, unmaking not only her own careful arithmetic of self-protection, but, in smaller and quieter ways, the fearful arithmetic of a girl who at once, cruelly and thoughtlessly, tried to wound her with the very same accusations London had long ago taught Honora to fear most: that she was too old, too unremarkable, to deserve anything better than what the world had already styled. Gabriel's own father deserves, likewise, a fuller accounting than the brief, unflattering sketches offered earlier in this telling, For a man is rarely so simple as his worst decisions make him appear, and the late Marquess of Rothmere, whatever his failings as a father and a steward of the family's fortune, had not been born to those failings so much as grown into them, slowly, across a lifetime shaped by pressures Gabriel himself would only fully understand once he had inherited the whole weight of them. The elder Lord Rothmere had come into his own title unexpectedly young, at 23, upon the sudden death of his own father in a hunting accident, and had spent the 4 decades of his tenure attempting, with steadily diminishing success, to live up to a standard of inherited grandeur he privately believed himself inadequate to sustain. He had married the Marquess, then simply Miss Eleanor Hartwell, daughter of that same lady's companion mother whose story the Marquess had shared with Honora at Ashworth Park, not entirely out of calculation, though calculation had certainly played its part, but out of a genuine, if imperfectly expressed, admiration for a woman whose quiet steadiness seemed to promise some antidote to his own private uncertainty. He had loved her, in his fashion, for the whole of their marriage, though the loving had grown over the years, increasingly obscured beneath the weight of his own anxious striving, investments pursued in the hope of proving himself equal to his inheritance, rather than merely its custodian, each failed venture compounding the debt and the desperation both, until the whole enterprise had become, by the final years of his life, a kind of slow-motion catastrophe he lacked either the courage or the self-knowledge to properly address. Gabriel had watched this decline through the whole of his boyhood and young manhood, watched his father grow more distant with each passing failure, more consumed by ledgers and correspondence, and the particular anxious silence of a man who has stopped believing himself capable of solving the problem he has created, and had absorbed from the whole long spectacle a set of lessons he would spend the years after his father's death, slowly, painfully unlearning, that affection shown too openly invited disappointment, that a man's worth was measured chiefly in his ability to sustain an inheritance, rather than von a knapp. One that the still writes, "My dad that's to be what bit big for that." I used to believe, Gabriel confided to Honora, some months into their marriage, on an evening when the subject of his father had arisen unbidden over a matter of estate correspondence that required sorting through the old Marquess's remaining papers, that my father simply did not love us, my mother, myself, as deeply as other men seemed to love their families. I have come to believe, examining these old letters, that the truth was rather sadder than that. I believe he loved us a great deal, and simply could not find his way to expressing it honestly, because he had convinced himself that honest expression of anything, including affection, constituted a kind of weakness he could not afford to display, not to his tenants, not to his creditors, and eventually, not even to his own wife and son. He held up a letter, yellowed with age, that he had found among the estate papers that afternoon. A letter, it transpired, that the elder Marquess had drafted to his young son but apparently never sent, discovered folded among a stack of unrelated correspondence, as though its author had lost his nerve at the final moment and simply set it aside, unable to complete the sending. "My dear Gabriel," Gabriel read aloud, his voice unsteady, "I find I do not know how to tell you, in the ordinary course of our days together, how proud I am of the young man you are becoming, nor how deeply I regret the distance I have allowed to grow between us, born of my own shame at debts I have not found the courage to properly resolve. I hope when this inheritance eventually passes to you, that you will manage it with a wisdom and honesty I have too often lacked, and I hope, more than that you will find a way to be a warmer father to your own children than I have managed to be to you, not from any failure of love on my part, but from a failure of courage I pray you never inherit alongside the title." The letter ended there, unfinished, and Gabriel set it down with hands that trembled slightly, moved by a grief he had not expected, after so many years, still to feel so keenly. "He never sent it," Gabriel said. "I do not know when he wrote it, or why he set it aside rather than finishing it. I only know that I have spent 11 years believing myself unloved by a man who was, apparently, trying, however imperfectly, however incompletely, to say precisely the opposite, and simply lost his nerve before the saying was done." Honora took the fragile letter gently from his hands and read it through herself, and understood, reading it, something further about the man she had married. Understood why he had mended Hollis Farm's roof within a month of his father's funeral, why he had argued so fiercely against enclosing the common land at the cost of his tenants' welfare, why he had argued so fiercely against enclosing the common land at the cost of his tenants' welfare. why he had knelt in wet grass to apologize rather than allow pride to prevent the honest reckoning their own early rift had required. He had spent 11 years, she realized, quietly completing the unfinished letter his father had never found the courage to send, writing its intended message not in words, but in the whole conduct of his life since. A courage his father had lacked, made manifest at last in the son who had inherited both the title and, eventually, the wisdom to wield it more honestly. He would be proud of you, Honora said softly. Whatever fear kept him from finishing that letter, I do not believe for a moment he would fail to recognize, in the man you have become, everything he hoped for you and lacked the courage to say plainly. Gabriel drew her close, and they sat together a long while in the gathering dusk, the unfinished letter set carefully aside to be kept rather than filed away with the ordinary estate correspondence, a fragile, imperfect bridge between a father's silent regret and a son who had, in the end, found the courage his father never quite managed, not merely to inherit an estate, but to inherit, and finally, complete, an unfinished expression of love. London, it must be said, did not receive the news of the engagement with universal grace, and it is worth pausing to record something of the wider course of drawing-room opinion that swirled around Honora and Gabriel throughout those months, if only because Honora herself, for all her hard-won indifference to society's judgment, could not entirely escape hearing fragments of it, carried to her second hand through Charlotte's breathless reporting, or Prudence' more sympathetic relay. At Lady Farrington's card party, held some 3 weeks after the initial announcement, the assembled matrons had debated the match with an intensity generally reserved for matters of considerably greater national consequence. I do not say she is undeserving. Lady Farrington herself had been overheard to remark, in tones calculated to carry precisely as far as she intended, but one cannot help wondering what precisely recommended her, beyond whatever peculiar fancy struck the Marchioness on a single afternoon's outing. It seems a very great deal of fortune to stake on a passing impression. I have heard, offered a Mrs. Ainsworth, not to be outdone, that Miss Vane possesses a temper quite unsuited to a Marchioness's dignity. Sharp-tongued, you know, and entirely too fond of speaking her mind in company where a more seemly woman would simply hold her peace. This observation, relayed to Honora by an amused Prudence, had struck Honora as sufficiently accurate in its particulars, whatever its intended cruelty, that she had laughed aloud upon hearing it, considerably undermining whatever sting it might otherwise have carried. There were 2 quieter voices in the chorus, women who had themselves once occupied positions not unlike Honora's own, unmarried past the fashionable age, dismissed and overlooked by the same careless arithmetic, who found in her unlikely triumph something considerably more personal than idle gossip. Lady Cecilia Thorpe, a widow of 38 who had spent the better part of 2 decades enduring precisely the same casual dismissal Honora had grown accustomed to, sent a private note of congratulation that moved Honora rather more than any of the season's more public commentary. I do not know you well, Miss Vane, the note read, but I have watched, from the edges of every ballroom I have attended these 20 years, women like myself treated as a kind of cautionary tale, our unmarried state held up as evidence of some deficiency we ourselves are rarely permitted to properly examine or explain. I confess I wept a little upon hearing the news of your engagement, not from envy, though I will not pretend envy played no part at all, but from something closer to hope. If London can be made to admit, even once, that a woman's worth need not be calculated solely by the date of her marrying, perhaps the arithmetic itself might begin, slowly, to change. I wish you every happiness, and I thank you, though you do not know me, for the hope your story has given a great many women who will never trouble to write and tell you so themselves. Honora kept that letter for the whole of her life afterward, tucked among her most private correspondence, and found herself returning to it on the occasions when London's louder, crueler chorus threatened to trouble her composure. A reminder that whatever the drawing rooms chose to say aloud, there existed beneath the surface performance of fashionable opinion a quieter and more genuine constituency who understood, from hard experience, precisely what her small, stubborn refusal to accept the ton's cruel calculations had actually accomplished. Even Almack's patronesses, that most formidable and unforgiving tribunal of London's social hierarchy, found themselves obliged to revise their opinion of Miss Vane, whose vouchers for the exclusive assembly rooms had been, for 6 years running, quietly and permanently withheld on the unspoken grounds that a spinster of her modest fortune scarcely warranted the honor. Lady Jersey herself, encountering Honora at a smaller gathering some weeks before the wedding, had studied her for a long, assessing moment before remarking, with a particular dry amusement that constituted her highest form of approval, "I confess, Miss Vane, that I find myself reconsidering a great many of my prior judgments, watching you these past weeks. I do not often admit to error. I admit to this one gladly. You shall have your vouchers, should you ever wish to trouble yourself with Almack's again, though I suspect, from what I have observed of your temperament, you shall find rather more satisfaction in declining them than in accepting." Honora had, in the end, declined them. A small private satisfaction that she confessed to no one but Gabriel, who had laughed aloud upon hearing it, and declared it the single most characteristic decision she had made in the whole of their acquaintance. Honora's own mother, dead these 4 years, had been a woman of quiet, unfashionable conviction whose influence Honora carried with her, largely unspoken, through the whole of this story. And it seems fitting, before the tale draws to its close, to grant her memory the fuller accounting she was rarely afforded during the busy unfolding of events themselves. Mrs. Vane, christened Margaret, though her husband had called her Meg for the whole of their marriage, a familiarity Honora remembered with particular tenderness, had come from a family of modest clergy stock, marrying Honora's father for what appeared, by every surviving account, to have been genuine affection rather than any calculation of fortune or connection, since neither family had possessed much of either to offer. She had brought to the marriage a fierce, quiet independence of mind that had shaped Honora's own character more thoroughly than either of them, in the ordinary business of daily life together, had ever paused to examine directly. "Your mother," the elderly Vane family physician, Dr. Whitfield, told Honora once, some years after Margaret Vane's death, called upon to attend Honora through a minor illness, "was the only woman of my acquaintance who ever successfully argued a point of medicine with me, and proved, upon investigation, entirely correct in her reasoning. She had no formal education to speak of, beyond what her father the vicar saw fit to teach her from his own library, but she read everything she could obtain and thought about what she read with a rigor I have rarely encountered even among physicians trained for the purpose. I confess I found her occasionally exhausting to argue with, and considerably more often right than I cared to admit at the time." It was this same fierce, self-taught independence that Margaret Vane had passed to her only daughter, along with the unfashionable roses that had traveled, by the story's end, from a modest London garden to the grander soil of Ashworth Park. A small, unglamorous inheritance that Honora had come to value, over the years since her mother's death, rather more highly than any dowry or connection London might have preferred her to possess instead. Rather more highly than any dowry or connection London might have preferred her to possess instead. She would have liked the Marquess enormously, Honora told Gabriel once, during one of their quiet evening conversations before the fire. The two of them would have argued for hours over some point of household economy or estate management, and enjoyed every moment of the disagreement, I think, rather more than either of them would have enjoyed simple agreement. My mother never trusted easy agreement. She used to say that people who agreed with you about everything had generally stopped thinking about anything at all. A sentiment my own mother shares entirely, Gabriel said, which perhaps explains why the two of us have managed, in our own fashion, to build something rather sturdier than easy agreement would have produced. I find myself wishing I had known her, your mother. I think I would have liked her very much indeed. I think, Honora said, that she would have told you precisely what she thought of your father's mismanagement of the estate within 5 minutes of meeting you, and would have expected you to argue back rather than simply nod along politely. I think, knowing you as I do now, that you would have risen rather admirably to the challenge. It was a small, quiet grief, this absence of her mother from the wedding and everything that followed it. A grief Honora carried privately, tucked beneath the general happiness of the story's unfolding, surfacing chiefly in small, unguarded moments like this one, over roses transplanted to richer soil, or a wedding circlet cut from a garden her mother had once tended with her own hands. But it was, Honora found, a grief that had softened considerably, over the months of her courtship and marriage, into something closer to grateful remembrance than raw loss. The particular alchemy that time and genuine happiness together can sometimes work upon even the deepest of old wounds, transforming them, slowly and without erasing them entirely, into something a person can carry forward rather than simply endure. The days immediately preceding the wedding itself passed, for Honora, in a peculiar blend of ordinary domestic bustle and quiet, private significance that she would remember in later years with particular fondness. Not the grand set-piece moments that make for dramatic telling, but the small, accumulated texture of a life being assembled, piece by piece, into its new shape. There was the afternoon spent with the marquess sorting through decades of accumulated Rothmere household linens, the old woman narrating, with evident relish, the provenance of nearly every item. A set of embroidered pillowcases worked by Gabriel's grandmother during a particularly tedious mourning period. A christening gown, yellowed now with age, that addressed 4 generations of Rothmere infants, and would, the marquess declared with a significant look that made Honora blush furiously, doubtless dress a 5th before too many more years had passed. There was the morning spent with Charlotte, of all people, poring over the guest list with a diligence that had, somewhere in the preceding weeks, transformed from calculated social climbing into something that looked, to Honora's genuine surprise, rather more like actual sisterly investment in the occasion's success. "I know I have not always been the kindest to you," Charlotte admitted during one of these sessions, not quite meeting Honora's eye. "I told myself it was merely honesty, pointing out what London expected of an unmarried woman past her prime. But I think, examining it honestly now, that I resented you rather more than I ever admitted. Resented that you seemed content with less than what I had been taught to consider necessary for happiness, when I myself had spent considerable effort securing precisely the sort of match London approved of, and found it, in the end, rather less satisfying than the effort had promised. I am glad, Honora, genuinely glad that you have found something better than what either of us was ever taught to expect." It was not a complete reconciliation. Charlotte remained, in many respects, the same woman she had always been, prone still to occasional sharp remarks about fashion and prospects that Honora had learned, years before, simply to let pass unanswered. But it was, Honora recognized, a genuine olive branch, offered with more vulnerability than her sister-in-law had ever previously permitted herself, and she accepted it in the same spirit it was offered, grateful for whatever small thaw the preceding months had managed to work even in relation she had long ago given pip of imper. There was, too, a final visit paid to Prudence's mother's grave, Mrs. Halloway having died some 2 years before, her long illness finally ended, where the two women stood together in quiet remembrance of all the private griefs that had shaped their long friendship, before Prudence, wiping her eyes, turned to Honora with a small determined smile. "She would have adored watching all of this unfold," Prudence said. "She always said you had more sense than the whole of fashionable London put together, and considerably more courage than you generally credited yourself with possessing. I think she would have found this whole story exactly the sort of vindication she always insisted you deserved. Even in the years when I confess I myself had begun to lose faith that it would ever actually arrive." "You never lost faith," Honora said. "You simply worried, as any good friend worries, while continuing to believe regardless. I could not have managed any of this without you, Prue. I want you to know that plainly, before the wedding sweeps everything else aside. Whatever happiness I have found, you have been beside me through every year that made the finding of it possible." The two friends embraced, there among the quiet gravestones, and walked home together in the fading afternoon light, already anticipating, with equal parts excitement and nerves, the wedding now only days away. That evening, the last before the wedding itself, Honora found herself unable to settle to sleep, restless with the particular anticipation that makes rest impossible, even when the body is thoroughly weary, and rose at last from her bed to sit at the window of her small room at Ashworth Park, watching moonlight silver the parkland beyond the glass. It was there that the Dowager Marchioness found her, some hour later, having herself risen unable to sleep and drawn by whatever instinct governed her uncanny ability to locate people precisely when they most needed finding, to the room where her future daughter-in-law sat wrapped in a shawl against the night's chill. "Wedding eve nerves," the Marchioness observed, settling herself without invitation into the room's single chair, as was entirely her custom. "I remember them well, though it has been the better part of 40 years since I last suffered through a night such as this one myself. I do not believe the sensation improves with distance, only with the reassurance that comes of having survived it once before and found the marriage, on the other side of the nerves, worth every sleepless hour that preceded it." "I am not nervous about marrying him," Honora said. "I am entirely certain of that, more certain than I have been of anything in the whole of my life. I think I am nervous, rather, about becoming what the marriage will require me to become, a marchioness, a mistress of estates, a public figure whose every choice will be scrutinized by exactly the sort of drawing-room chorus I have spent 6 years learning to ignore from the comfortable safety of irrelevance. I do not know that I have properly prepared myself for losing that particular safety. You have not lost it, the marquess said. You have simply exchanged one form of it for another, considerably more useful for irrelevance protected you these past 6 years, because London found nothing in you worth the trouble of attacking directly. That protection is gone now. I grant you, you will be watched and judged and occasionally attacked, precisely because you now occupy a position worth attacking. But you will also possess, for the first time in your life, genuine power to answer such attacks on your own terms, rather than simply enduring them from the sidelines. I have found across a rather longer acquaintance with this particular difficulty than you presently possess, that power used honestly is worth considerably more than safety purchased through invisibility. You will not always enjoy the scrutiny, but you will, I promise you, come to value what the scrutiny is the price of. Honora considered this for a long moment, watching the moonlight shift across the silvered parkland below. I think, she said finally, that I have spent so many years learning to make myself small enough to avoid notice, that I do not entirely know yet how to occupy space that other people are actually watching. I do not mean that as complaint. I mean it as honest uncertainty about a skill I have simply never had occasion to practice. Then you shall practice it, the marquess said with brisk, practical affection. As you have practiced every other difficult thing life has required of you these past 6 years, and you shall discover, I do not doubt, that you are considerably better suited to the practicing than you presently credit yourself with being. I did not choose you for my son because I believed you already perfect for the position, Honora. I chose you because I believed you capable of growing into it honestly, which is a rather different, and, I think, considerably more valuable quality to possess. Perfection bores me. Honest growth, undertaken with genuine courage, I have found endlessly worth watching. She rose then, patting Honora's hand with the same brisk affection she had shown from their very first proper conversation, weeks before, in a curtained alcove off a crowded ballroom. Sleep now, if you can manage it, or simply rest if sleep proves elusive. Tomorrow will arrive regardless of how thoroughly you have prepared yourself for it, and I have found, across a great many tomorrows of my own, that readiness matters rather less than most people believe. Courage carries one through considerably more reliably than readiness ever has. She left Honora alone with the moonlight and her own settling thoughts, and Honora, watching the old woman go, felt something in her chest ease at last into something like peace, not the absence of nerves, which persisted stubbornly through the remaining hours until dawn, but a quiet confidence, newly settled, that whatever the coming years asked of her, she would not be asked to face the asking alone. The days immediately following the wedding itself passed in a quiet, unhurried settling that Honora had not fully anticipated, having spent so much of the preceding months focused on the wedding as though it constituted the story's proper conclusion, rather than understanding it, as she came gradually to understand in the weeks that followed, as merely its true beginning. Ashworth Park became, in those first weeks, not merely a house she visited, but a house she was learning to run, and Honora discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that the practical business of managing so grand an establishment suited her considerably better than she had expected. The same careful attention to detail that had governed 6 years of stretching a modest household budget proving, it transpired, remarkably transferable to the rather grander scale of estate management, once the underlying principles were properly understood. You have a head for figures, the estate steward, Mr. Pruitt, observed, some weeks into her tenure, with the particular surprise of a man who had not expected a new mistress to trouble herself closely with the household accounts, rather than leaving such matters entirely to his own discretion, as the previous marquess had generally done in her later years. Forgive me, my lady, but I confess I did not expect to find a bride so recently arrived taking quite such an interest in the granary accounts. I spent 6 years managing a household considerably more modest than this one, Mr. Pruitt, on a budget that left very little room for error, Honora said. I find the principles remain largely the same, whatever the scale. I should like to understand the whole of what I am now responsible for, rather than simply trusting that all is well because no one has troubled to tell me otherwise. I hope you will not find my interest an imposition. Not an imposition at all, my lady, Mr. Pruitt said, with what Honora recognized over the following months as genuine and growing respect. I confess it is rather a relief, if I am honest, to have someone take a proper interest. The old marquess left a great many matters to drift in his later years, and I have not always felt confident my own judgment alone was sufficient to catch every difficulty before it grew serious. I welcome a second pair of eyes, my lady. Particularly eyes as sharp as yours have already proven themselves to be. Gabriel, watching this partnership develop over the following months, found himself repeatedly, quietly delighted by discoveries of precisely this kind. Small proofs, accumulating steadily, that the equal partnership he had asked of her in the garden all those months before was proving, in the daily practice of married life, considerably richer and more substantial than either of them had perhaps fully anticipated when the terms were first negotiated. I confess I did not marry you expecting a business partner quite so capable as you have proven to be, he told her one evening, reviewing together the quarter's accounts, which showed, for the first time in a decade, a modest but genuine surplus. I do not say that as complaint, you understand. I say it as continued and growing astonishment at precisely how much I underestimated what I was gaining when I asked you to marry me in that garden. I did not fully understand it myself, Honora admitted. I knew I wanted a marriage built on honesty and equal partnership, in the abstract sense we discussed. I did not entirely anticipate how much genuine satisfaction I would find in the actual, practical work of it. The granary accounts, the tenant disputes, the whole unglamorous machinery of actually running an estate honestly rather than merely inheriting the appearance of doing so. I think perhaps I needed, after 6 years of managing very little with very few resources, to discover that I was capable of managing rather more, given the proper scope to attempt it. It was, in its way, the truest fulfillment of everything the story's earlier chapters had promised. Not merely romantic happiness, considerable as that happiness proved to be, but the fuller, quieter satisfaction of a woman finally given room to become everything her own long-suppressed capability had always suggested she might be. Had London's cruel arithmetic ever troubled to look closely enough to notice? There remains one final thread worth gathering before this story draws properly to its close. The fate of Julian Faircroft and Prudence Holloway's own courtship, which unfolded in the months following the country party. With rather less drama than Honora and Gabriel's own tumultuous path, but with no less genuine feeling for the absence of spectacle. Faircroft, it transpired, possessed a small independent income from an aunt's inheritance that, while nowhere near the scale of Rothmere's own fortune, proved sufficient to support a comfortable, if modest, establishment. And he had spent the weeks following the country party in what he later confessed to Gabriel had been the most genuine anxiety of his adult life, uncertain whether a woman of Prudence's evident good sense would truly consider a match with a man whose chief accomplishments, by his own admission, ran chiefly to whist and waistcoats rather than any grander achievement society generally rewarded. I do not know what recommends me to her, beyond the fact that she seems, inexplicably, to find my particular brand of foolishness tolerable rather than merely tiresome, he confided to Gabriel, some weeks before he finally worked up the courage to make his intentions formally known. I have spent a great many years cultivating the persona of a harmless, entertaining fribble, precisely because it asked nothing of me beyond amusing company, and protected me from ever having to risk genuine rejection on the strength of anything that actually mattered. I find, rather to my own alarm, that I want, for the first time in my life, to risk exactly that kind of rejection, because the prospect of not trying has become considerably more frightening than the prospect of trying and failing. I believe, Gabriel told him, with the dry understanding of a man who had recently navigated precisely this same terror himself, that you have simply described the entire experience of genuine courtship, Faircroft, stripped of whatever protective foolishness either of us previously hid behind. I found, in my own case, that the terror never entirely vanished. I simply decided, eventually, that Honora was worth risking it for. I suspect you have already reached the same conclusion regarding Miss Holloway, whatever remaining hesitation troubles you in the details. Faircroft had, indeed, already reached that conclusion, and proposed to Prudence not with any grand gesture but during an ordinary afternoon walk, in words considerably less polished than his usual practiced wit generally produced. A stammering, genuine confession that surprised them both with its rawness, and which Prudence, laughing through unexpected tears, accepted without hesitation, I have spent 8 years, Prudence told Honora afterward, believing myself destined for a quiet, useful spinsterhood, caring for my mother, and then, after her death, simply continuing the habit of usefulness in whatever direction presented itself. I did not expect, at 28, to find myself genuinely, foolishly happy in precisely the manner I had long ago stopped permitting myself to hope for. I think, watching your own story unfold this past year, I gave myself permission at last to believe such happiness might still be possible, even for a woman well past the age London considers fashionable for such discoveries. The two friends were married within the same 12-month, in a ceremony scarcely grander than Honora's own had been, and the four of them, Honora and Gabriel, Prudence and Julian, settled into a friendship that would sustain all the remaining years, meeting frequently between Ashworth Park and the Faircroft's more modest establishment. The easy warmth of old confidences deepened, rather than diminished, by the fresh happiness each couple had found. And so this story, having wound its way through dress shops and ballrooms, through storms and gardens and quiet country roofs mended for no grander reason than that mending them was simply right, arrives at last at the only ending such a tale could properly deserve, not a single dramatic conclusion, but the accumulated evidence of an entire life built, deliberately and honestly, on ground that had been tested, argued over, and found, again and entirely sound. Honora, Marchioness of Rothmere, would go on to become, in the years that followed, precisely the sort of woman London had once declared impossible for a spinster of 26 to become, not merely a wife, but a genuine partner in the whole considerable business of an estate's management. Not merely a hostess, but a woman whose drawing room became known, gradually, as a place where genuine conversation was valued rather than merely performed, where old seamstresses and young debutantes alike found themselves treated with the same careful attention, regardless of what either than merely performed, where old seamstress she would raise children. 3 of them, in time, each taught from earliest memory the particular family creed that character mattered more than title, that kindness extended to those who could not repay it constituted the truest measure of a person's worth, and that a roof, once noticed to be leaking, ought always to be mended promptly, whatever the ledger's advice on the matter. She would remain friends, for the whole of her life, with a Modesty's assistant on Bond Street, who never forgot the day a young woman had refused to look away, and with a clergyman's wife who had once, cruelly and thoughtlessly, tried to wound her with the very insults London had spent 6 years teaching Honora to fear, and who had, in the years since, become instead something rather closer to genuine family. And she would remember, always, on the ordinary Tuesdays that punctuated the whole long unfolding of her considerable happiness, that the entire improbable story had begun with nothing grander than a small paper of sewing needles given to a stranger who needed them, without any expectation whatsoever of what the giving might eventually return. And that, dear viewers, is how a spinster refused a countess, refused a cruel rumor, refused every rule a transactional world had written for her, and found, in the refusing, exactly the life she had been told, for 6 long years, that she would never deserve. Thank you so much for staying with Honora and Gabriel's story all the way to the end. If this slow burn had you holding your breath, the dress shop, the ballroom crossing, the storm in the long gallery, or that quiet garden proposal, let me know in the comments which moment was your favorite. If you enjoyed this one, please give it a like, share it with a fellow romance lover who needs a good happy ending tonight, and subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next tale. Until next time, take care of yourselves and don't ever settle for a love that asks you to be smaller than you are.